This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It's 3 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We could invent a new word. Your mind works in a similar way to mine. Glenn and Alex both coming in on this one. The word would be disingenric. A sort of combination of disingenuous and honest Bob Jenrick. I mean, I hesitate to give him too much oxygen, frankly, but I did hear him being interviewed earlier by Nick, and my ears were on stalks. I mean, how can anybody who's held the position of Justice Minister and presided over, I think, an almost existential collapse of our entire criminal justice system, suddenly start trying to take pot shots at the new lot 5 months in to the job? Rishi Sunak was told by Alex Chalk, his prisons minister, I think, that releasing prisoners early was absolutely essential, but he didn't do it. And there is one school of thought that suggests, I mean, they were already, of course, releasing prisoners earlier than scheduled, but he was told by Alex Chalk that they'd have to do what the subsequent government did, and they didn't do it. There's a school of thought that suggests one of the main reasons why he called the election early was so that he didn't have to announce the early release scheme that the next government was forced to immediately adopt. And then Jenrick pretending not to understand why participants in the so-called Farage riots this summer were able to be jailed at a time of prison overcrowding. The answer being the same as how any newly convicted criminals are going to prison. You free up the space for the newly convicted by releasing some of the previously convicted a little earlier than scheduled. I'm surprised how cross I am about this, because that level of dishonesty is quite frightening. To think that a senior politician could appear on national radio and speak in such, it's parcel tongue, frankly, to speak in such dishonest and, well, to be generous, to give him the benefit of the doubt, maybe he's just very, very stupid. But I don't think so. I think it was epic and deliberate dishonesty. To pretend not to understand what an early release scheme is designed to do, i.e. free up prison places for the newly convicted, i.e. participants in the so-called Farage riots this summer, and B, not acknowledge that 14 years of government created precisely the scenario in which not only is that scheme necessary, but also the new Justice Secretary revealing this morning that 14,000 more prison places will not guarantee that we won't run out of space again over the next few years. You can't get a quart into a pint pot, as my old grandmother never used to say. I never met my grandmother, but it's the kind of thing that grandmas say, isn't it? You can't put a quart into a pint pot. If you have got too much stuff and only so much vessel, then some of the stuff is not going to fit in the vessel. But it doesn't really make sense to me. I'm sorry to say that, because I've sensed that I'm saying it a little bit too often at the moment. You tune in expecting me to make sense of things for you. I can make sense of the political dishonesty. Of course I can. I've written blooming books about it. I can't quite make sense of how they continue to get away with it. But what I can't make sense of is the detail, the granular detail of how on earth this could happen. I know the obvious answers to that question. And I know, to be fair, that COVID will have played a part, that the lockdown and the log jam, whether avoidable or not, and frankly, anything that Boris Johnson was in charge of that turned out bad was probably avoidable. But that ship has sailed, that milk is spilt, whether avoidable or not. Obviously, the huge log jam in our courts is a contributory factor to the shortage of spaces in our prisons, because as the log jam eased, I presume that the levels of the numbers of people making their way to jail became unprecedentedly high in that shorter period of time. But how we could have allowed this to happen, well, and part of the reason, of course, is the client media. So many members of my profession spent that 14 years, particularly the 6 years from 2016 to 2024, particularly the 3 years that Boris Johnson was in Downing Street, just completely derelict duty, doing absolutely no journalism whatsoever, tickling Boris Johnson's toes most days, pretending that everything was absolutely fine when the iceberg was hoving ever closer into view. So that's part of the problem. I've got a brilliant missed information for you later today, for example, about government stationery that is being misrepresented in an almost criminal fashion, if you pardon the conflation of topics. But it's typical of what happens if you are part of a media that told you Brexit was going to be brilliant, Boris Johnson was a stand-up guy, Liz Truss was an economic genius, and austerity was correctly demanding that ordinary people in Sure Start centres pay the price of epic irresponsibility and mismanagement by some of the richest people or some of the richest bankers in the world. I think it's incredible, right? So, do you want to have a crack at this? Who can tell us? How has the criminal justice system ended up in such a parlous state? How? Because this is supposedly, statistically, one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It is supposed to be civilized. We think of ourselves as very much first world, don't we? I think still rightly. How on earth has this been permitted to happen? It can't just be the fact that a supine, sycophantic client media allowed the clowns in the Conservative Party to get away with murder for years. That can't be the only reason. Of course, if we had been doing our job better, and some of us tried, then some of these massive problems that have become clear in recent months may have been smaller or even ameliorated entirely. But I genuinely, I'm not a stupid person. I pay attention to what is going on around me. I sometimes stumble across things I feel I should have known before, like yesterday when we discovered that leaving the European Union meant that assisting people smuggling in Germany, if the destination was the UK, ceased to be a crime. You could call it the Farage loophole, if you like, that actually decriminalised people smuggling in Germany if the destination was the United Kingdom. Another magnificent benefit of Brexit. So there's stuff I miss. There's stuff I don't understand. There's stuff I can stare at forever. What's the analogy we usually use? We usually use the magic eye stuff from the 80s. Do you remember? Those sort of weird optical illusions where you'd stare at a page of a colouring book for, well, hours sometimes and wait for this sort of weird image to emerge, like a steam train or a lion would emerge in the background, somehow hidden in all the fractals and all the patterns. I feel like that about the news sometimes. You stare at it for long enough, then you will make sense of it. The image will emerge. But this is absolutely mad. Absolutely bonkers. And the idea that honest Bob Jenrick pops up today trying to lecture the new government on what... It's a bit like someone turns up in your kitchen and does a poo on the floor and then starts giving you advice on how to clean it up. It's absolutely extraordinary. Robert Jenrick pooing all over the place and then lecturing the owners of the home, the new owners of the home, on why they should be cleaning up his mess and what they should be doing to sanitise the environment that he's polluted with his filth. Truly, it's almost refreshing to have a day like this. You think you're going mad, don't you think? New government, new era, new language, new vocabulary. Up pops honest Bob Jenrick, famous chiefly for painting over murals of cartoon characters in a processing centre for unaccompanied children. And now he's trying as a former Justice Secretary, therefore who bears more responsibility than almost anybody else alive for the mess that the criminal justice system is, waltzing around studios this morning as if he's got the flipping answer. What did you do when you had the actual job, you irredeemable bucket? It's extraordinary what we allow these people to get away with. And nothing's changing, is it? Still getting their toes tickled, still getting patted on their head and sent on their way with a polo mint and good wishes when they should be eviscerated, should be torn to shreds for the audacity of trying to lecture the new lot on what they should be doing to clean up the massive pile of manure that you have covered the country in. Robert Jenrick. Jeez. 12 minutes after 10 is the time. Should have had Classic FM on this morning, actually. It would have been better for my blood pressure. But here we are, looking at the prison system and asking this question. How did this happen? I'll tell you something for nothing. It's got absolutely nothing to do with Keir Starmer, Shabana Mahmood, or any current members of the cabinet. What happened? So you are a lawyer. You are I guess a criminal would work, perhaps. A prison officer? I don't know. Would a prison officer even know? Perhaps you're a former Justice Secretary who's made a habit of defecating all over the space and then telling other people how they should be cleaning it up. Maybe you could give me a ring and tell me how this happened on your watch. How has this country, this wealthy, civilized country, managed to create a situation in which we've got more prisoners than prison places? Why didn't they build more? Question mark. 0345 6060 973. Who else has been in touch? It says, you still on the fence then, James? No, I don't. I never know. Do you know? Can you tell which stories are going to ignite my righteous indignation? I can never tell. Sometimes I don't know until about 4 or 5 minutes after 10. I come on air at 10 o'clock. I'm not even sure what I'm going to be talking about. I just start thinking about things and then, boom, the whole thing explodes. I go high-pitched. That's probably the best indication. I never know which stories it's going to be, but something about that man, that ridiculous human being, accusing others of being out of touch, just sort of, I don't know, it ignited something. But that's not the point today. That's not the question. The question of how Robert Jenrick has permitted to steal a living is one for the ages. The question that we can actually address today is about, very simply, prisons. Prison places. Does it stretch to courts? 1,700 inmates let out earlier than scheduled in England and Wales in September, another 1,200 in October. The new prison strategy will build 4 new prisons and create 6,500 new places. Building new blocks on current prison sites will create the same sort of number. I listen, as a fully paid up member of the liberal elite, there's a large part of me that wonders whether this is actually the answer. David Gork, a politician who I think has covered himself in glory since being ejected from the Conservative Party by Boris Johnson's rabble, David Gork speaks today very persuasively about a need for a complete rethink. You would have thought, wouldn't you, that a Labour government might be a little bit more mindful of alternative approaches. But I suppose we come back to the rabid, sycophantic client media, don't we? If they did start trying to be more efficient and deal with the addictions of prolific offenders with specialist courts instead of just locking them up for ever longer sentences, almost like a revolving door at the prison gates, then we would probably improve the overall situation. But the current politicians would get a kicking from the Daily Mail, so they're too scared of doing it. Front pageophobia, which I don't think they suffer from unduly, but they clearly suffer from a bit. So just tell me how. Let's do an idiot's guide. And I will be the idiot, all right? Today, Matthew, I am going to be the idiot. Because I want to know, simple, complicated, detailed, evidential, experience, whatever it is. How have we ended up in such an almighty mess? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I live in England. England and Wales is usually the focus of the statistics. I don't know whether things are better in Scotland or Northern Ireland. I will probably find out in the course of this morning. But I live in a country where there are not enough prison spaces for prisoners. And yet rates of offence and recidivism have not exploded. There are not more and more people being convicted. There are more and more prisoners overflowing at the seams of our prisons. So that means that 2 things have happened. It means that there have been policy decisions that anybody with half a brain could have seen would be disastrous, and that there have been unforeseen circumstances or misunderstood ideas that I don't currently grasp. So, help me out. How has this happened? 0345 6060 973. And does anybody want to have a go at addressing the question of whether we lock up too many people? Do we actually lock up too? Is this the wrong answer to the wrong question? I don't know. But let's kick off with the first one. How did this happen? 0345 6060 973. And one thing I would mention is that if you voted for Boris Johnson or for Rishi Sunak, then you are partly to blame for this. So don't get cross with the people trying to fix it. Get cross with the people who gulled you into thinking that they were capable of running a country. And, of course, with the journalists who encouraged you to believe that absolute nonsense. How did this happen. All right? Hit the numbers now. You will get through.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 19 minutes after 10. I suppose part of the anger comes from the knowledge that if you let these jokers get away with it, everything gets worse. So, how have we ended up in a country where the prison system has buckled at the seams? And I tell you, I'd love to talk to someone who is supremely unsurprised. Was anyone warning about this 5 years ago? The secret barrister's pretty strong on some of this stuff, but that's more to do, and it's linked, with the court system than the actual prison system. But how on earth have I ended up living in a country where the prison system is completely broken? Michael is in Hednesford in Staffordshire. Sorry, I had to put my teeth in before I said that, Michael. What would you like to say?
Hi, James. Yeah, Hednesford.
Hednesford. Carry on.
No problem. Second-time caller. Thanks for having me on again. So I can only speak from my previous experience in the probation court service.
Yes, that'll
do. And I think they play this. I can see this happening in a small element, but I can only imagine if it's happening in other departments. I can see how things have just completely broken. So when things moved from a paper-based system to a digital system just before COVID, we implemented a system in which essentially the probation service officers wrote down to the administrative staff, that was me, what the essentially what the court orders were, and also the allocation of who was going to write the pre-sentence report. And that was all done, I'm not joking, on Microsoft OneNote for the whole court. And if you can imagine,
but that doesn't. I'm going to be a bit of a pain in the proverbials today, I think, because I want to finish this conversation with at least a better grasp. That doesn't explain, unless I've misunderstood you. I mean, that would explain why it had always been awful. It wouldn't explain why it was so awful now, would it?
I think it has a big part to play because we used such inadequate technologies to essentially manage people's workload and make them less chaotic. Is that people got stressed? Probation officers.
So this was the shift from paper to technology that created, you think, new problems.
Look, it's probably a drop in the ocean.
But all drops. We need all the drops, and then we've got the ocean, Michael. There you go. That's almost a proverb.
But all the drops are the. If I can imagine the attitude was similar in other government departments that led up to this, I can imagine why things got out of hand. I think people are not aware just the amount of overlooking and lack of forward planning and lack of assessment.
So you're speaking of sclerosis, aren't you? You're speaking of borderline chaos or an almighty mess, a big behemoth that moves slowly and inefficiently. But that doesn't deliver the kind of Rosetta Stone of understanding how the prisons could have reached breaking point, because theoretically the prisons would adapt to the sclerosis, so the people coming out the end would have completed their sentences in time for the people going in at the beginning to start theirs. What you describe, I don't think, accounts for this collapse.
I think that there were some people who were sent to prison that could have been on probation purely because of OneNote. I promise you.
Okay, right. Thanks. Sorry. I said I was going to be playing the role of the idiot today, Michael. I didn't realise I was going to fit it quite so perfectly, but I now have a better understanding of what you're saying. So almost as a sort of hack or a swerve of the inefficient system, some people who shouldn't have been sent to prison in the first place have been sent to prison, which increases the numbers that need prison spaces in a way that wasn't previously true.
Yeah.
Thank you. I knew it was worth pestering you and badgering the witness on this occasion. 24 minutes after 10 makes sense to me. Because what you've got to remember is that political decisions are made up there by people like honest Bob Jenrick, and then down there, people like Michael have to implement them. They have to process people. They have to process human beings. And, of course, if the system of processing is unfit for purpose, then what are you going to do? You're going to lean towards letting people go, or are you going to lead towards locking people up in the current climate, in the climate created by the client media over the last 14 years? You're going to lean towards locking people up. Raymond is in Clapham. Raymond, what would you like to say?
Well, I mean, like I said to your producer, I mean, I do think in my personal opinion, so that I don't get anyone in trouble, I think there's a lot of corruption going on, personally.
Right.
And one of the things that I said to you previously in regards to mental health, in terms of dealing with the issue at the grassroots level, because my wife is a mental health nurse, and she had to go into a police station yesterday to deal with a teenage girl.
This is important. So this is the idea that the collapse in mental health care, which again is a consequence of austerity, the policies of governments that honest Bob Jenrick was part of. I don't know whether anyone pointed this out to him today. That has left strains on the criminal justice system that would previously have not been their business.
Yeah. I mean, so she went there, and this 16-year-old girl had taken a knife at her teachers in college.
Oh, dear.
And to me, the money that they're going to spend, the millions or billions that they're going to spend on prisons, they need to start investing back into the country, into the grassroots, youth centres, mental health services, because you've got to look at the bigger picture as opposed to the short-term goal, because the prisons are going to, like you said, the prisons are going to get full again. They're going to run out of spaces again, and then they're going to build more prisons. How about we focus on not getting people into prison as opposed to creating spaces for them?
I mean, that's why David Gauke's suggestions today, he's the head of sentencing review, so that's a government appointment, and he's talking about specialist courts to help prolific offenders break addiction. So it's prevention, isn't it, rather than cure? Prison's not a cure, so prison's not a cure. So then you move towards prevention and better mental health provision to stop people descending into scenarios where they end up becoming criminalised, and removing people from the patterns of behaviour that create repeat offending, that create recidivism.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I wonder, do you know, that's amazing, isn't it? So we've got the first answer with regards to the actual sclerosis of the system, and then you pointing out, for all my shouting and wailing about the last lot, but austerity actually shifting burdens from areas of public provision and public service that are being cut back to the bone to the bit that you can't actually
I wouldn't
dispense
even say cut back
with.
to the
What would you say?
It's just been disintegrated. It's just been it's been cremated.
Yes, and the bit that you can't cremate is the prison. So the prisons are like the bottom of the pyramid. Everything that gets dropped as a consequence of what you describe has to stop falling somewhere, and the place it stops falling is the prison system.
Yeah, they're just scattering the ashes there, basically,
I think you're right. Yeah. I think there's something in that. And I mean, you're doing it from the outside looking in, albeit that your wife is a mental health nurse. I wonder whether people in the system can put some flesh on those bones. The idea that the prison system is like the crumbs tray in the toaster, or it's like the bottom of the pyramid, and all of the stuff that would once have been dealt with by the public sector, by the health service, or by mental health care, or by the probation service, which of course Chris Grayling was responsible for kebabbing, or by youth services or social interventions, all of these things that David Cameron and his colleagues started getting rid of in 2010 create, they sort of punch holes in the fabric of society through which people then fall. And at some point they have to stop falling. And that is the prison system. And that is what happens when too many people are falling to the bottom. The bottom overflows. Remond is top of the class today so far, and I was a bit impatient with him at the beginning when he mentioned corruption. There's a lesson for us all there. Be more patient. 28 minutes after 10 is the time. 0345 60973 is the number you need. I'd like to send a message to anyone who knows Steve. Steve Alford. He's been in touch to say, James O'Brien doesn't need to play the role of an idiot. He does it every single day. He is quite literally deranged. Please spare us from this complete tool. If you know Steve Alford, could you show him how his radio works? Could you possibly take a moment? I don't know whether he's in the car or whether he's listening at home. Hopefully he's nowhere near scissors. But if you know Steve Alford, could you possibly just show him how to either retune his radio dial or press a button? It's probably easier these days, isn't it, than retuning or maybe he could just, maybe he's listening on a smart device. He could just tell it. Could you show him how to speak to his smart device in a way that allows him to understand that this program is not compulsory? There are plenty of people who believe that it should be. I, for the record, am not one of them. I think that it is pearls before swine in the case of some people, not mentioning any names, Steve Alford. But if you do know him, could you possibly teach him how to operate his own radio before he does himself a mischief? It's 10:30. Here's Jenny Barsby with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
2 minutes after 10. I've got a magnificent missed information for you today. Missed information is a new feature, which, as you will know, if you're a regular listener to the programme, means that I will almost certainly forget about it completely very, very soon, having gone to the trouble of begging, pestering, importuning for my own sting, which is the technical term for what I used to call a jingle. The sting is the thing that sort of introduces the feature, or stingle, if you like, and we've got one now, which means, and it took so long to, it was like getting blood out of a stone, honestly. It means that we will almost certainly forget it, but it is designed to show you how you are being manipulated by usually right-wing media. And today's missed information story involves £1,200 being spent apparently on 2 ring binders. So obviously, if you've got a brain cell to call your own, the first thing you'll think is, that sounds a bit unlikely. I bet there's more to this than meets the eye. But of course, if you haven't got a brain cell, or if you are reading a columnist or listening to a broadcaster who doesn't think you've got a brain cell, then you could probably be persuaded that this is a scandal on a scale with Profumo. I'll give you the proper details of that a little later in the programme. 10:33 is the time. Back to the prisons and the very simple question of how the hell we've ended up in a situation where, even as the Justice Secretary announces plans to open 14,000 new prison places, she simultaneously warns us that it won't be enough to guarantee the end of early release. And we're getting there, aren't we? And the bit I'm worried about, and the bit I probably expected Labour to be more active in, albeit that the appointment of David Gauke and his sentencing review is cause for cautious optimism, is the point that Remond made just before the news, and that they don't seem to be prioritising prevention. They seem to be prioritising cure, while actually prison probably isn't a cure. We talked earlier about special educational needs, didn't we, earlier this week? And we know the levels of literacy among the prison population, levels often of undiagnosed neurodivergent conditions. All of these things, it involves spending money today to save a fortune tomorrow. That should be a slogan. Spending money today to save a fortune tomorrow. Whereas austerity, we're saving money today and it will cost us a fortune tomorrow. Oh, that's good, isn't it? That is British politics of the last couple of decades in a nutshell. David Cameron and George Osborne, we need to save money today, and then bracket, but it will cost us an absolute fortune tomorrow, close brackets. Labour Party coming in and saying we need to spend money today, brackets, and they should be saying this bit louder, it will save us a fortune tomorrow. That is probably the beginning of the end of the answer to the prisons question. They saved some money today, but it's costing us a fortune tomorrow. And guess what? We're in the tomorrow now. Nick's in Medway and Kent. Nick, what would you like to say?
Hello, mate.
Hello, Nick.
Just going on from what Raymond said, I'm somebody who used to be in the prison system. I've been on both sides.
How come?
So
Tell me more.
I was a career criminal for I did 23 years behind the bars.
Good Lord.
Over a period of 40 years.
Okay.
I then made the decision that I didn't want to do that anymore, and I wanted to get out and try and work with the system to make other people's lives better.
What happened? What happened to make you change path after so long?
Some good people around me, actually. is the
inside or outside?
Inside.
Really?
And outside. Yeah, most. I mean, therein lies the problem, and Raymond's touched on it, that they don't spend the money in the right places. My experience is that because they've diluted all the experienced prison staff, all the experienced probation officers, all the experienced people who used to work with you, have the knowledge and understanding to work with people on resettlement. See, they don't fund resettlement anymore. What they've done with resettlement is they farmed it all out to all these private companies, mostly owned by Tory governments, families and friends, and all these cranker companies that provide the minimum services for the maximum amount of money.
Saving money today but it'll cost us a fortune tomorrow.
Exactly that.
I need to warn everybody. I need to warn everybody, not just you. I'm going to be saying that a lot in the coming years because it explains so much, doesn't it?
Yeah, I've worked in prison education. I've worked in housing, CAS housing, which is community accommodation services, which is the absolutely abysmal housing that they put people in when they're released from prison.
Which obviously increases the chances of a speedy return to prison.
Well, people would rather go back to a prison cell that's clean and warm and tidy than live in absolute squalor in these charity houses and private sector housing that are absolutely abysmal. I've worked in 3 of these, and I've left every one of them because I could not conscionably put people into rooms that weren't fit for farm animals to live in.
And somebody, certainly with the private sector one, somebody's making a profit out of that provision.
But the problem is that all the private companies that are contracting to the prisons, the probation service, the medical services, the mental health, they're all making a profit. It's all about profit, and it's all about minimum service for maximum profit. So they cherry pick every bit of the contract where they can make money, and they don't deliver the services that they're employed to do.
Of course they do. That's what their shareholders expect.
Yeah.
It's like running a water company, isn't it? And scoffing at the idea you should be spending money on fixing pipes.
It makes me so angry because
you can keep the money. It makes me blooming angry as well. But I mean,
we don't rehabilitate anybody. There is no such thing in this country as rehabilitation. It's about retribution and about profit.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm now 12 years past all of that. I've not worked for a day. I've come out of the whole system now because I get so frustrated with it.
Well, it's a Sisyphean task, isn't it? You just at some point you will go mad if you can't feel you're making progress.
I so want to be working with people who could reflect the journey that I've taken away from offending.
Yeah.
But I'm not allowed to because A, I see it for what it is, and B, because I'm still beaten over the head with my criminal record every time I try and get vetted or a DBS.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can see why, but it does seem suboptimal, doesn't it? It does seem inefficient. Who would be better qualified to map the journey that you've made than you?
Can I just explain to you what happened with my experience with the probation service?
Yes, you can.
So I worked directly for the probation service. I've still got the ID card. I was a support worker in the approved premises. Do you know what the probation hostels?
Right.
So they got me in. They specifically recruited me because of my lived experience.
Yes. Because
I'd been through it. They then found that they couldn't vet me because the company that holds the vetting contract doesn't have a means to vet people with criminal records. You can only vet people who come out without a criminal record.
Sounds like Nigel Farage's party.
Yeah, so they got me in on a bank contract. And I worked on that bank contract for a year.
Right.
And my managers said that I was doing such a good job, they wanted me to take a full-time contract. When I applied for a full-time contract, they withdrew my bank contract and said that there was no likelihood of them ever being able to vet me.
And this is because the company making a profit out of providing the services is not big enough, if you like, or not invested enough in what it's supposed to be doing to have a system in place that would allow it to vet you.
Yeah, basically. So anybody would...
It's Kafkaesque. It's a very overused word.
Lived experience. Any company now that recruits on one's lived experience, I don't believe it anymore. I think that just ticks a box.
And this is the sort of thing I don't know about you, and I don't need to know your politics, but I would have expected a Labour government to be a little bit more mindful of that Benjamin Franklin quote that Jamie's just reminded me of. An ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. And prevention can kick in after prison, not just before. It's not just about stopping people going to prison in the first place. It's about, as I think Nick has perfectly explained, it's about stopping people going back to prison. And that is part of the answer. There's a lot coming together this hour. I'm blessed once again with callers who know what they're talking about while I continue to play the role of the idiot. Thank you, Nick. Stay safe. Will's in Stockwell. Will, what would you like to say?
Well, hi, James.
Hello.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what people have said so far, but I think we're still missing one big factor.
Go on.
Which is sentences have just got longer and longer over the last 20 years.
Right.
So people go in for longer. As prisons are under pressure, it's hard to do the work that helps them prove that they're safe to get out. And I think it really goes back. I mean, I have to be careful how I say this. I used to spend a lot of time in prison about 15 years ago working for a charity. And, you could see then that already the pressure from longer and longer sentences was really driving the population, alongside all the stuff people write about, which is, more and more short sentences, people coming in and out, the sort of general chaos.
It's a largely media-created confection that you describe. It demands for long sentences, lock them up and throw away the key, and which goes alongside claims that prison is a holiday camp. And the politicians that have buckled to that pressure from the media are the same politicians that have presided over the consequential collapse. It's confusing, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, I think there's two really confusing things. One is it hasn't made anyone any happier.
No.
There's no sense that sentences are longer. And the other thing is, I think it's cross-party.
Yes.
I think it really goes back to the 90s and that kind of,
David Blunkett.
You move. Oh, yeah, exactly. So there are still loads of people in prison on the indeterminate sentences that he brought in and were then dropped just because there isn't the capacity to do the work to help them get out. So I think something happened in the 90s where both parties switched from prison as an unfortunate necessity to it's a bit of a political arms race.
I think you're right to remind us that it's both parties of government, but I think my thesis stands. I think that they both buckled under pressure from kind of Sun newspaper-style journalism, didn't they? And felt that whether they felt it ideologically, that locking people up for longer would somehow help, or whether they were doing it for reasons of self-interest doesn't really matter, because the bottom line is that they did it. How long ago could you have possibly predicted what we're seeing now, do you think?
Easily 18 years ago.
Wow.
But I think
because if you're locking up more and more people without building more and more prisons, eventually this happens.
Well, yeah, and also rehabilitation is a process. It's not just about time spent. So are you working with people on their offending behaviour and reducing that? Are you training them? Are you helping them think of a life outside? If you've got a system that's in crisis, you're just pushing people around. I mean, I remember going to one prison where they'd opened an amazing rehabilitation centre to settle people back in West London and begin their lives almost within prison. And as soon as they opened it and they said, does anyone have anyone who meets this criteria? It was full the next day.
Wow. Just
because people needed space anywhere, just beds.
That's incredible.
So you can't do that work. And then on top of it, as you've pointed out, when you add in austerity, I mean, prison and emergency A&E are really the only capacious public services. They can't say no.
That's a great word. And that's what I mean by the bottom of the pyramid. So people are falling. The more austerity you have, the more holes you have in the fabric of society. The more holes you have in the fabric of society, the more people fall through them. And the place where they stop falling is A&E and prison.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a real penny drop day today for me. Thank you.
Just to give you one, if I could give you one, just to sort of make it come alive a bit. If you look at the average custodial sentence in length in months,
yes,
for just say money laundering,
yes,
you can see that's gone up from 20 months to 30 months, rounding up, over the last 14 years, and you can see that across sentences and tariffs for life sentences across the piece.
And we don't really know why, except for the political...
Well, it's a mixture of sentencing guidance, it's a mixture of legislation, it's a mixture of sentences, judges and magistrates wanting to reflect a public mood, in my view.
Yeah, and is it even the public mood? Is it even the public mood, or is it the sort of, as is so often the case, that just the loudest voices that are being listened to? I'm struck by something else as well as you speak, actually, Will, which is what would happen if... not dissimilar to the story I'm going to discuss after the next break involving stationery in a ministerial department. But what would happen if a certain type of journalist got hold of a story about a space where prisoners are being looked after, former prisoners are being looked after, and they're living in relative comfort? I'm thinking back to what Nick said about squalor. The idea that these people don't deserve to be looked after or helped probably adds to the malaise that you're describing, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it was really powerful, that point about the places we outsource people, the outsourcing we do, the places we put people in. And you can see whole seaside towns which have become, informally really taken over really because of low housing costs for
we were talking specifically
about
about Blackpool last week and life expectancy, which is going to be it's all going to be part of the same tapestry. Thank you, Will. Just a couple of people confused about something you said earlier about being in prison a lot. To be clear, Will was working for a charity and therefore visiting prisons. He wasn't actually banged up, although earlier caller Nick was. So all human life is here. 10:46 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:49. James writes, Darren, your book should have been called How David Cameron Broke Britain. He gets a chapter. He gets a whole chapter, Darren, and frankly, while writing that chapter, I probably felt more clouds clear than I did while writing any of the others, because we forget just how responsible David Cameron was, and George Osborne, of course, his buddy, for introducing precisely the policies and ideologies that have created a country where everything feels as if it is broken, into which space, of course, the worst kind of people can tread with simplistic solutions to complicated problems, which, of course, in Robert Jenrick's case, he can somehow contrive to deny or absolve himself of any responsibility for. Quite extraordinary, listening to his round of interviews this morning. I'm not even a year into the new government, and he's trying to blame them for all of the messes created by him and his Conservative colleagues, going right back to 2010, as Darren reminds us. The social contract is broken, James. I went to prison for this. I'm reading this, by the way. I'm not making an extraordinary confession live on the radio. This is Simon in Preston. Most people in prisons are in for either selling drugs because it's easier to make money that way, or because they've started using drugs to escape the reality of living in a broken society, and that leads to the theft and other crimes. So our outdated drug laws and all the other drops in the ocean you're discussing today, coupled with a lack of investment in infrastructure, has created a perfect storm. It's 10:11. Lizzie is in Edinburgh. Lizzie, what would you like to say?
Hi there, James. Well, I just wanted to start by saying thank you for having this conversation and approaching it with empathy and understanding, which is something we don't often hear when speaking about people in the prison population. That needs to happen more. I work with female offenders when they're coming out of custody. I work for a charity. We do rehabilitation support. We try to do as much as we can. And I think something that kind of surmises a lot of what the people have been saying is I have a lot of women who come out of custody and they preferred being in custody. And I don't think that's because of some people might argue, a soft touch approach or prison's such a nice place. But just if society is worse than being in prison, then what does that say about the society we've built for people who need the most support?
Do you know, there's echoes of refugee conversations here, isn't there? It's what you are running towards, even if it involves risking your life in a dinghy, is preferable to what you are running away from. And so prison is preferable to your alternatives, means that your alternatives are, to go back to Nick in Medway's vocabulary, squalid.
Exactly. And we know there's a housing crisis. When people come out of custody, often they are in worse accommodation than they were. They're open to drug abuse, alcohol abuse, people around them who are making them feel unsafe. They don't have the protection of prison guards. I'm obviously coming from Scotland, so it's a slightly different approach to justice up here. But we also had an early release scheme. And by far, the majority of people who are back in custody are people who were released.
Yeah.
It's not new offences. It's not that there's this massive criminal surge in the UK.
That's my impression.
It's people who have been in prison, have become institutionalised and are struggling to find a way forward. It's almost impossible to get a job as it is, let alone if you've got a prison record. Mental health services, you're waiting massive amounts of time to be seen. And benefits as well, I think it takes about 5 weeks for your benefits to restart. Now, 5 weeks with absolutely no cash. I think you get 80 quid when you leave the prison, depending how long you've been in. Also, you've then got the remand population, which is something I don't think's been spoken about. But when people are on remand, they don't have access to the same services as people who are on sentences do. And there's a massive remand population. So people who haven't even been sentenced in prisons, potentially released with no sentence or time served, who've been in there upwards sometimes of a year, with no access to services. Only access to when you're on remand in prison is to health services. You can't get access to training, to vacation, to education, to any of these other things which are part of rehabilitation.
You would expect a Labour government to understand this more than a Conservative government does. For me, the notion of hanging and flogging and throwing away the key is very much of a piece with right-wing politics. But the notion of what you've just said, empathy or understanding that people end up in bad places as a consequence of choices that have been made, and the fewer choices there are, the more likely they are to end up in bad places. I would have expected better from a Labour government. I don't know if you've heard noises that encourage you in your sector yet.
We have, obviously, Scottish Government, so it's SNP up here, and they have a lot of investment in restorative justice and rehabilitation. That's part of why I have my role. It's government investment into the charities as well. But
hard to measure, though, isn't it?
Charities still in the gaps.
And it shouldn't be charities necessarily. No, it's hard to measure.
I don't work for the SPS.
No, I understand. So, and if you succeed with somebody, where does that statistic appear? Somebody who would have gone back to jail were it not for your ministrations doesn't really appear anywhere. You might see an overall drop in numbers, but to achieve that, you're going to need a system that is 1,000,000 times better than where it is now. So your work is almost unmeasurable, isn't it? Which is kryptonite for politicians because they want to be able to point at graphs and numbers and charts all the time.
Yeah. Ultimately, I think it's across the board, and if the world that people are coming out to isn't a world of kindness and support, then they will end up back in prison. That is just what's going to happen. And I think people think that building more prisons is a great idea, but really we need to look at how can we keep people in communities and how can we support them in communities. Obviously, there's some cases then that's not going to work where you've got seriously violent offenders.
You're never going to do away with prisons entirely. No, exactly. So if you deal with addiction, if you deal with mental health, if you deal with special educational needs, if you deal with dysfunction and family breakdown, then you massively reduce the likelihood of people returning to prison. If you build more prisons while you don't fix these problems, which are growing, not shrinking, then it will be, as Shabana Mahmood describes, impossible to guarantee that everyone who gets sent to prison will have a prison place, even as you seek to create thousands of new prison places. Lizzie, thank you. Powerful stuff today. And I really do feel, as we approach the 11 o'clock, that I've got a better grasp of the facts than I had before. Oh, dear. Cosmo's in Lyme Regis. Cosmo, what would you like to say?
Hey, James, all right?
Good, Cosmo. What's on your mind?
Hey, nice to talk to you. I love the way you dissect the subject within an hour. It's beautiful, mate.
Well, only with the help of people like you.
Oh, dear. Well, I hope so. But
so the pressure's on now, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, mate. I've got so much to say. I don't think I've got enough time.
Oh, go on.
But I mean, I think this knits in with so much stuff, right? I remember a few months ago, someone was on it and they said something about the English problem. Do you remember that? Where there's just no investment in this country, and apparently it's been known on the continent for ages how, like, businesses just don't reinvest. And I think because businesses just took over the government so much, they're doing the same thing, mate. They just don't reinvest in these things. Yeah? They don't care. I mean,
private probation, private hostels, everybody looking how they can shave a few quid off the costs in order to keep it for themselves. And that makes me think of the water companies.
Yeah, and I'd done a bit of jail when I was a teenager, right? And even when I went in there, I was in the 90s, I noticed it was pathetic, mate. The only deterrent was it was just a waste of time.
Yeah.
That's the only thing I took away from it.
But that's quite bleak, Cosmo, because for me, the idea of being imprisoned is a deterrent in the sense of what I would miss.
Yeah.
So, but if you haven't got enough in your life to miss, that's quite a sad picture that you paint, isn't it?
But see, it seems like to me it's three things here that need to be done, right? To make like a sort of relatively crime-free society. And that is like, I remember in the early 90s when they brought in CCTV cameras. As soon as they'd done that, they got rid of all the old Bill walking on the street, obviously to save the dough. Yeah? But if you have that in combination with that, because what they're supposed to do, patrol the streets and prevent crime. You have them doing that in the first place.
So more visible policing, which the government have announced actually, but whether or not it comes to fruition, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, right. So and then you have the cameras obviously to back that up if people get away. Yeah. But then also at the same time you need like jobs that will provide people with flipping living, mate. Yeah, and that's enough, isn't it? Ain't that enough? I
would have thought so. So that you've got, well, again, it plays into the picture I was trying to paint of having something to lose. The more you've got to lose, the more of a deterrent prison becomes. So a decent job or a decent living is something that would weigh the scales in the opposite direction if you were teetering on the brink of recidivism and repeat offending, Cosmo. Brilliantly done, mate, and brought it in bang on time as well, like a pro. Thank you, and thank you for the kind words about the show, which are echoed quite widely today, actually. But as I always say, and it's not glib or facetious, it's pointless. I know I sometimes go on a bit, but without the callers on a day like today, we've got nothing. We've got absolutely nothing. Alternatively, we can end up with a better understanding of whatever issue it is that is under discussion. I'm going to be very similar space next. I don't see a way into a conversation about the politician calling for an end to marriage among first cousins. It would have, actually, I'll give you a little hook and tease. Who do you think is the most famous person to marry their first cousin in the last 200 years of English history?
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11 is the time. Queen Victoria and Jerry Lee Lewis. I think who's more famous, Queen Victoria or Jerry Lee Lewis? Why are we speaking about them? Answer: because they both married their first cousins. I think Jerry Lee Lewis was underage, actually, by conventional standards, but Queen Victoria, Prince Albert, first cousins. So I don't know why that bloke who got himself a new seat. Do you remember? He was chairman of the Conservative Party and he knew he was going to lose, so he sort of awarded himself a new seat to fight, having promised that he wouldn't. So he's still in Parliament. I suppose honest Bob Jenrick needs some competition for being the most disingenuous member of the Conservative Party, but he's been calling for a ban on first cousins getting married. And then an independent MP from Dewsbury and Batley responded by saying you can actually do genetic tests on people to see whether they are going to be caught in the catchment area where their children are not more likely to suffer from genetic problems than if their parents were not first cousins. So the Queen Victoria contingent, although I don't know if anyone mentioned her in the House of Commons yesterday. The royal family, in fact, is... I imagine the history of the royal family involves quite a lot of cousin marriage. I think that the reason why the law stands as it is probably to do with Henry VIII's love life and making it easy to marry almost anyone you wanted. I think it's a miracle he didn't marry his horse at some point. 4 minutes after 11 is the time. There's quite a lot coming up today. It's PMQs. Anybody else finding themselves looking forward to PMQs? I asked you this last week in a way that you haven't done before, because the speed with which Kemi Badenoch inserts her foot into her mouth is a spectator sport. Although she was better last week. Maybe she'll continue on an upward trajectory. I saw a story somewhere about her getting upset. She's managed to upset Nigerians. Is there anyone she doesn't upset? Is there anyone whose nerves Kemi Badenoch does not get on at the moment? That might be a question for Mystery Hour. I haven't forgotten about the folders, Alan. Don't worry. I'm just getting the sting ready. Keith's having a yoghurt at the moment, so I don't want to disturb him unduly. The truth behind the story about the £1,200 folders is one that I think you will enjoy. We touched yesterday upon the corruption trial that Benjamin Netanyahu sought to dismiss. A little bit harder for him to dismiss a new film that... contains footage of his interrogations. Documentary filmmaker who has put that together into a new cinematic release called the Bibi Files will be joining us at about 12:30 today after PMQ. So as I say, there's a lot to get through. But the next conversation we're going to have, sometimes I'm conscious of being a bloke, being unhelpful in the context of some of the conversations that we have. Because the question I'm going to ask now, and I've checked with female colleagues that this is a reasonable question to ask, because I don't want to sound a bit like yesterday's topic where people poo-poo special educational needs because they involve conditions that we weren't aware of when we were young, therefore they must not exist. Imagine if people adopted that approach to other conditions. Imagine if there was radio phoning in the 19th century and they sort of discovered cholera. And someone said, that's ridiculous. We didn't have cholera when I was a kid. You can drink whatever water you want. It didn't do me any. All right, 48 people died on my street one summer, but hey ho, they could have been hit by a comet. You got to go one day. Who knows? Cholera, schmollera. Imagine if people had adopted that approach. Maybe they did. Maybe there was huge scepticism surrounding all manner of newly emergent medical conditions. But I don't want to be like that with medical misogyny. which is the phrase used today to describe the process by which thousands of women are left in needless pain for years. It's a finding of a House of Commons committee. And the idea, or the contention rather, is that women and girls are being told to, quote, suck it up, end quote, and endure discomfort that interferes with every aspect of their daily lives because medics are not receptive enough to their symptoms. I suspect that there is a misogynoir dimension to this as well, because we've talked in the past about how black women are sometimes poorly treated by the health service because of a sort of traditional perception of physical robustness. So that, that black women can put up with more pain. So on the labour ward, their experience will be different. That's been measured. And proven. And what I wonder with this story is how you know it's misogyny. I do believe, as we discussed yesterday, that if men had periods, or if men could get pregnant, or if men suffered from the menopause, then the world would look very different. I think that sanitary products would be freely available in all conveniences, all public conveniences. I think all companies would probably be required, if it was men doing the menstruating, then all companies would be required to provide free sanitary products. If men could get pregnant, there would be no debate anywhere in the world about abortion at all. Of that, I am absolutely certain. And if men got the menopause, then again, employment law would be completely rewritten to accommodate the reality experienced by men. But because it's women, none of that happens. And indeed, when someone points out that women have to endure menstruation, pregnancy and menopause, and wondered out loud on social media what the equivalents might be for men, 30pence Lee Anderson responded, "How about the Battle of the Somme?" I incorporated that into the little tease that goes out 15 minutes before the end of Nick's show, and it did occur to me as I listened to it upstairs that you might not know what I was talking about. So a woman on social media literally asked, what's the equivalent? We have to do pregnancy, menopause, and periods. What do men have to do? And 30p Lee Anderson responded, how about the Battle of the Somme? Which, of course, happened long before he was born, but he cited as an example of something that all men throughout history have had to endure. Anyway, on we go. So how do we know it's misogyny and not something else is the question that I've got for you. I don't want to be that bloke who kind of sounds a bit squeamish when he starts discussing reproductive matters. But the conversation at work today was largely about coils, having coils fitted, and an apparent disregard for the pain that can cause in a medical context. But colleagues did share the information that it would often be a female practitioner who was trying to install a coil, if that's the right word to use, in a slightly overly robust fashion. So how is that? Is that I mean, if that was a man, would they have been behaving differently? I don't know. What I wanted to do was establish my credentials with regard to recognizing what institutional misogyny looks like. That's why I've referred back to pregnancy, periods, and menopause. I truly believe, I will go to my grave believing, that if we men had to endure any of those things, then the world would look very different. So I am not what you might call a misogyny denier. Maybe it's not Badenoch today. Is Starmer away? Is it the deputy? Anyway, I'm getting distracted. I'm not a misogyny denier, but I don't have the knowledge or the experience to know for sure that what is being described by the Commons Select Committee is medical misogyny as opposed to medical misery or medical unfortunate stuff, things that would happen to anybody. It's not specifically female. I mean, look, a lot of the reproductive stuff is going to be specifically female, undiagnosed reproductive conditions, but you can't really compare the male experience of an undiagnosed reproductive condition with the female experience. We don't get endometriosis. Men don't get a lot of the conditions that are under discussion here. Naga Munchetty, the broadcaster, has been incredibly powerful in this space. And she indeed gave evidence to MPs describing that she'd been gaslit by the NHS because she would present with symptoms of a womb condition and she would be dismissed, or in her words, gaslit. How do you know that is misogynistic, that is specific, like the bad treatment is a consequence of being a woman, the condition is a consequence of being a woman, but how do you know that the medical establishment is engaging in misogyny? And the way to answer this is actually to share our experiences. The idea that you know that if this happened to men, the medical establishment would be dealing with it differently. When were you pretty certain that the unhappy treatment you were receiving from the medical establishment was a consequence of you being a woman? The pain that you suffered, or the gaslighting that you endured. How do you know? Well, we'll start off with what happened, and then we'll move on to the question of whether it is an example or evidence of medical misogyny. They talk of a pervasive stigma and a lack of education about common female conditions. So in a way, and I apologise, it's taken me 5 minutes to work this out. In a way, what we're wondering is whether we add this to the list. So pregnancy, periods, menopause, and then reproductive conditions. If these problems were causing men enormous pain, compromising men's ability to have children, then would the medical establishment be responding to them in an entirely different way? As soon as I phrase it like that, I start thinking, yeah, of course they would. So it's funny, isn't it? Sometimes it's worth me going around the houses on these meandering introductions, because it probably just fits on the same list, doesn't it? Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that this is anywhere near as bad as having to fight in the Battle of the Somme. But do we add reproductive conditions? So you go to the doctors with great pain, but it's a reproductive condition, and therefore, because you're a woman, you feel that you're not taken as seriously as perhaps you should be. Hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060 973. I know it's because I'm a woman, James, writes Evie, because gynecology in the NHS is horrendous. All the fertility treatment is non-NHS funded after one cycle. And there's always someone trying to make it about the men, but I quite enjoyed this one from Andrew. As a man, I have to endure the shame of being the same gender as 30p Lee Anderson. There you go. That's a burden that all men have to bear, although I don't think it's quite as heavy as the one we're about to discuss. It's 11:15. The question is pretty simple. What is medical misogyny, and when did it happen to you? 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 11:16. Marianne adds to the list. She says, James, if men had babies, nobody would have a sibling. That's a little bit unfair. I mean, men endure enormous pain on a regular. I once had a terrible toothache, Marianne. How dare you suggest that men wouldn't be able to endure the pain of childbirth? I'm being facetious, obviously. 17 minutes after 11. Medical misogyny. What is it? And how do you know when you are experiencing it? Rose is in Highgate. Rose, what would you like to say?
Hiya. I do have endometriosis and I've had it for a number of years.
Can you tell us what it is? I know you know, and I know, but for people who don't know, can you just talk us through what that means?
Yeah, so my understanding of it is, I mean, it could be wrong. I'm sure someone listening that, doesn't completely know what it is that when you have your monthly menstrual cycle, all of the blood and kind of materials doesn't shred completely, and it attaches onto like parts of your womb, your ovaries, other organs. And then that causes like extreme pain, and it can cause actually the organs to kind of malfunction. For example, some people have them on their bowels, and it kind of mimics like IBS symptoms, but they don't know they have endometriosis.
Okay.
So that's kind of they can get like kind of heavy bleeding, a lot of pain, can stop a lot of like kind of your day-to-day activity.
Yeah, so it's when the lining or the tissue that's similar to the lining of the uterus starts growing outside the uterus, and
essentially, and attaches to all kinds of random places.
Yeah, exactly that. Carry on.
So I had an operation last July. I had like several large cysts. My ovaries were actually twisted completely because they were just kind of in a bad way. I had to have them separated. load of tissue excised, kind of mesh placed in the middle to prevent them twisting again.
Yes.
So it was quite an intense operation. The recovery was quite kind of unexpected. I was able to go private, so I was quite lucky in that fact. So I believe that the NHS waiting list is kind of in excess of 3 years or something once you do get the correct diagnosis. So I do feel like there is kind of, limited information available. But
how do we know it's misogynistic, Rose?
I don't believe it is.
Oh.
That's my kind of thing. So in terms of kind of treatment, so obviously there's so many different, diagnosis, conditions, everything like that. A GP can't be expected to know everything. So they will have the base level of everything. That's the whole reason why they're a general practitioner.
Yeah.
So I guess my kind of input would be like kind of early signposting to the right services. But in terms of like treatment from, say, male versus female GPs and general kind of practitioners, whether it be in A&E setting or in the doctors, I have personally found men to be more receptive and willing to listen to what the conditions are and what your symptoms are, versus if it is a female without, the extra speciality in it, it's kind of, well, I have periods every month. Like, it's not an issue. Man up. Well, not man up, but you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, suck it up is the phrase that's being used. It's odd because Emma's been in touch with the opposite perspective. It doesn't even need to be reproductive. My partner goes to the GP and he gets seen, heard and referred. I actively avoid going now unless I'm in crisis mode because I know I'll be fobbed off for months to years. But I mean, the uterine material that you describe can't happen to men, so there's no earthly way we can compare the twin experiences, because there is not a twin to the experience. How much ignorance is there? Because I suppose if it was a condition that men had, we could probably make a case, and Caroline Criado Perez does this incredibly powerfully in her book Invisible Women, that the entire establishment is geared towards the male experience as opposed to the female experience.
I mean, I guess if you said that we would have conditions that were solely for men, for example, prostate cancer, and that, is on the rise completely. If that was the case, then that wouldn't be there. It would be a lot more early intervention, and you wouldn't get to the point where men are dying of it. So I don't necessarily agree with that at all.
No, well, I mean, good in your experience. I'm glad to hear that. Although the Common Select Committee would point perhaps to the possibility that it's a more real problem or a more real phenomenon than you've had the experience of. But good. I mean, you don't want people to be going through unpleasant experiences. 21 minutes after 11 is the time. Rachel is in Romford. Rachel, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
I love your show, by the way.
Oh, thank you very much.
So I started having really, really bad period pains when I was a late teenager, early 20s.
Yeah.
And the first time I went to A&E, I saw a male consultant.
Right.
And he said, "Oh, is it not just period pain?" I said, "No, I am throwing up. I am in that much pain. I am throwing up." And he was like, "Oh, have you ever had period pains before?"
Gosh. So, I mean, clearly we are thinking, both of us, that this is something that a woman wouldn't have said.
Yes, yeah.
And I don't know how you'd disprove that. I don't know how you'd argue with that. And it made everything worse because you felt that you were essentially being accused of either exaggerating, malingering, or not being tough enough.
Yeah.
So what did you do? What did you say?
I was young. I didn't really want to argue. They just gave me painkillers and sent me home.
And again, I mean, there's a sense, isn't there, an air that this has got to be misogynistic. It's a big word, but it seems the accurate word. But tricky to pin down unless you'd had a comparable experience with a female doctor who had behaved in a much better way. I don't know. 22 after 11 is the time. Rachel, the phone line's a bit poor, so I'm going to crack on to Davinia, who is in Hatfield. Davinia, what would you like to say?
Hi.
Hello.
So I have endometriosis as well. You might get a few people calling in about this today. I'm actually waiting for my 5th surgery right now. Been waiting over 18 months. It's stage 4, which is bowel infiltrated. Yeah, it's extremely it's horrendous. I can only, describe it as a horror movie.
And have you been going to the doctors periodically for years and telling them that something's wrong and they've missed it or they've failed to... Go on, sorry.
I had a male doctor. My symptoms started roughly around when I was 14. And every time I went to the doctor with issues with my cycle, excruciating pain that's crippling to the point of where you're crawling on the floor to get to the bathroom in floods of tears, or you cannot move at all. And I was told that it's your cycle, every woman goes through it, dismissing my pain as if it was something that is a normal, and that I should just rise through it.
Wow. How do we know? And I know I keep circling back to this question, and it may not have an easy answer, but how do we know that this is a part of the male-female dynamic, or that this is an example of misogyny? You'll
find that a lot of gynecologists or in the profession are male.
Yes.
It's still male. It's a female condition, but it's a male-dominated industry. You go to them with your pains, and do you have a handful that will listen to you and will work through sort of care plans with you, but then you get the others that are just sort of robotic and are not very sort of they don't listen to you. They just take everything as a tick box.
But that might happen, and I'm only being the devil's advocate.
Yeah, totally.
That might happen in all other medical contexts as well. Consultants in particular often have a reputation for being quite aloof, don't they, and for being quite arrogant. And I don't know that you've necessarily got the... I don't know that we've got the basics yet, the proof yet, that it's a part of a male-female or a misogynistic dynamic. I'm not doubting you. I'm just trying to. I'm just worrying at the issue. Really, I'm wondering if we were in court, how would we prove it to the jury?
Well, I think the fact that it's taken so many years for them to push for investigative procedures to find out what's going on, and just sending you off, packing you off with a handful of painkillers that aren't necessarily going to sort of even mask it.
I think pain is the key here. And actually, Lind has just sent me some research from 2021 that gender stereotypes could lead doctors to underestimate women's pain. Healthcare staff, both men and women, often discount women's pain. So when a man consults a doctor about pain, and this is where you can have comparisons, you can compare pain with pain. The cause of the pain may be unique to women or something that men can't suffer from, but pain is pain. And he will hope to be taken seriously to convince the doctor that the pain is real and that the problem needs addressing. Women who suspect, according to this research, that gender stereotypes are part of the process, the doctor will conclude that they're not in as much pain as they say they are. That's very much been your experience.
Yeah, but you also mentioned earlier on, just before the start of callers, about the statistics with black minority and ethnic individuals with pain. So that also has to counteract into the situation for myself anyway.
It's part of the same graph, isn't it? I mean, misogyny noir, which is a concept I was only introduced to on this programme, is when misogyny meets racism. So it's going to happen to you because you're a woman, and it's going to be worse if you're a black woman.
That's correct.
Because there is a sense that you can
put on top of it the multiple fibroids that black women get as well. Yes. So when you put that on top of the endometriosis, you can imagine what the pain is like. It's excruciating.
Yeah. I know. Well, I can only imagine it, and of course, I can't. Well, also, I mean, what could make anything worse is not being believed, not being seen, and having a doctor tell you. I'm interested to read in this research from UCL from 3 years ago that it could be a female doctor or a female healthcare staff as much as a male. So if I present to a woman, she's going to be less likely to doubt me when I describe excruciating pain. I mean, there is possibly, if I go full devil's advocate on this, there is probably some basis for the idea that men wait until later than women do before they go to the doctor. So I had incredible pain once, and it took me about a week before I'd have gone to the doctors, whereas if it had been my wife, I think she'd have gone on the second day. But the pain was unbearable. I mean, men notoriously postpone healthcare visits because we're frightened of finding out that something's wrong, or we're frightened of or we don't want to seem. So maybe just trying to understand it rather than doubt it, that might be part, perhaps, of the issue. So doctors and nurses have been conditioned over the years to deal with men presenting late when there's no doubt at all about the level of pain that they're in, and they've allowed that to seep into a degree of scepticism or dismissal when it comes to women. I don't know. We're just thinking out loud, but I'm very sorry for what you've endured, Davinia. That sounds absolutely hideous. It's coming up to 11:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Don't forget PMQs on the way at 12. And I absolutely must tell you the truth behind that story of the £1,200 folders that certain corners of the media are being deeply, deeply irresponsible about today. Jenny Barsby, though, has your headline.
James O'Brien on LBC.
2 minutes after 11 is the time. James, I must know the truth behind these folders, sharpish, because I have to get back to the Somme. Thank you. It's time for this.
Missed information.
Oh, can we have that? I like that. Can we do it again?
Missed information.
So this is a irregular feature wherein I try to tell you the truth behind headlines that are designed to provoke. So today's headline is Ministers spent £1,200 on 2 folders. And depending on how irresponsible your correspondent is, they will either omit some of the key facts or pretend that has been spent on a couple of bog-standard ring binders that you might find in your local branch of W.H. Smith's. I saw that headline and I immediately thought, I wonder whether it's William Foster or Barrow, Hepburn and Gale. Now, why would I have thought that? I'll tell you what, big prizes for anyone who can answer that. Why would I have thought it's either William Foster and Son or it's Barrow, Hepburn and Gale? And the reason that I knew this was a nonsense story was because back in the days of my when I was on the cusp of working in menswear and becoming a journalist, and for about 18 months I was doing both. I'd work in Aquascutum on Regent Street when I didn't have shifts at newspapers, and I kept the Saturday job on for quite a long time, actually, out of superstition. I didn't want to jinx the journalism by giving up the Saturday job. And I used to get the odd story from my work in retail. You may have heard my John Major anecdote. In fact, I'd almost guarantee it if you've ever spent more than 7 minutes in the company, in my company. But the reason I remembered William Foster and Son was because they were responsible for making ministerial boxes, beautiful pieces of leather, beautiful leatherware, that, you know, the red boxes that ministers make. And there's another company that does it, because I think William Foster's, it's definitely not on Jermyn Street anymore. I had a mate that worked there, and I went into the stockroom once, and they had the lasts. Do you know what a last is? The wooden mould that is unique to you. So, you know, you can get made to measure suits. You get a bespoke suit that is made to measure, literally does what it says on the tin. You get that with shoes as well if you're really rich. And they build a mould out of wood. I presume it's chiseled or something. Don't ask me the details. I'm never going to be in that market. But in the stockroom at William Foster and Son on Jermyn Street, I saw lasts. The two I remember, they had the Duke of Windsor and Cary Grant had both had shoes made, and they keep the last because then you can order. Obviously, you know how it works. And they had the contract for making ministerial boxes, and another company also made them called, as I said, Barrow, Hepburn and Gale. So as soon as I saw that headline, I thought, oh, I know what that will be. That they will be archives. They will be embossed leather folders that are used to store government documents for posterity. You know, when you go to a posh library and you've got like the bound copies of Punch or something like that, the proper posterity stationery. And lo and behold, I found one article about this after the story was brought to my attention earlier. Lo and behold, the folders from Barrow, Hepburn and Gale, a luxury leather goods manufacturer, cost £594 each. So the Department for Culture, Media and Sport has bought these folders. I will bet you any money you want that this is regular government purchase going back decades. In the same way that the ministerial boxes cost a fortune. You may not like the tradition, you may not agree with the tradition, you may think that it's time to break with tradition, but this is absolutely not an example of anything other than a long and well-established tradition that a certain type of journalist is going to try to pretend is something worse, is something sinister or suspect. So there it is. It's incredible, right? I don't have a view on whether we should break with this tradition that probably goes back to Victorian times. I quite like posterity. I want my government documents that are being saved for generations to be kept in nice spaces. I don't think they should be kept in boxes, old shoe boxes. But hey-ho, if that's going to save a few quid, then maybe you could start agitating for the National Archive to be replaced with a big old pile of shoe boxes. But that is what the story is actually about. It's not about somebody charging an obscene amount of money for a couple of old folders from W.H. Smith's. It's about a long and well-established tradition of embossed leather stationery being used to store government documents of particular importance. And that is why we invented the entire feature of
Missed information.
And I've got another one for you later today as well. But back to the more important matter of medical misogyny. Jackie is in Wivenhoe in Essex. Jackie, what would you like to say?
Morning, James.
Hello, Jackie.
Hello there. I'm ringing up because my daughter's. She tried to call last year on Sheila's show. It's about her condition, polycystic ovary syndrome, which is PCOS. It's undiagnosed. It's very common. It's sort of 1 in 10 women have it, and it's very complex because it's not just one thing. Not having cysts on the ovaries. She's got her insulin levels are through the roof. Her progesterone levels are through the floor. It can cause, weight gain. It can cause facial hair. It can, acne. All these sort of things that are sort of, young girls when they have this, thinking maybe it's just being a teenager or whatever, So, but she sort of was having very bad periods, and. She'd literally pass out and go hypothermic. So she'd be like 35.5 degrees, which is just not normal for, there's clearly something wrong. I mean, periods are,
And you know that. And you would expect the medical professionals to know that as well.
Exactly. So when she was 20, she went to have a scan, was told, yes, you've got PCOS, you've got cysts. And off she went. And that was it. Nothing else. She just, there you go. You've been served this diagnosis. You have PCOS. Yeah. No follow-up. So we had to do a lot of the legwork with the doctor, female doctor. And it was very, very difficult. They were just going to give her a pill, which is the wrong thing because it just didn't agree with her. So we had to go private because we had to see what was going under the bonnet, so to speak. Yes. Nothing. It was one just size does not fit all.
A pat on the head and sent on your way, effectively.
It's like, there you go, and off she went to university during lockdown, and everything kicked off. We've had to work really hard with the doctor, and she's still, she's gone back to the doctor because private healthcare is just too, it's not viable. We can't afford it.
No, of course.
But we know she's had her hormones checked. This is how she found out she's got her progesterone's low. Insulin is through the roof. So, of course, that affects what you eat. And you can have this weight gain unknown and this acne, everything. But it's so complex. There's just not enough discussion over this,
And how do we know? I mean, I'm not in any doubt anymore. I wasn't in much doubt to start with. But how do we know, if we were in court, how do we convince the jury that this is misogyny? And it's not just going to come from men. Misogyny is institutional. This phone-in is a little bit like phone-ins about racism in the police. And you can always find someone who'll say, what, are you telling me that all police are racist? But no one is saying that. They're just saying that there is an institutional malaise that means women are going to be treated in a way that men in the same situation would not be treated. But of course, we can never conclusively prove that, because you can never find a man with endometriosis or polycystic ovary syndrome. So where do you derive your confidence that this wouldn't happen to a man?
Well, there's just got to be balance, and there's got to be, it has to be, you know, there has to be the awareness put out there first and foremost, you know, and I think it's.
Do you think it goes back to Victorian times? Is it the notion of women being seen and not heard? I know that was usually children, but especially with reproductive stuff, it makes you defective in some way. Henry VIII would have chopped your head off if it back in the Tudor times. Do you know what I mean? Yes,
absolutely. No, you have your reproductive system. It's natural. Yes. It's normal. It's going to malfunction occasionally. But, you know, look at the amount of women that are suffering. And, you know, it's not just, oh, well, she's a woman, because, you know, you're meant to reproduce and all this sort of thing. It's far more complex, and it's, you know, for women that don't bear children, they can have far more complicated issues.
Yes.
My sisters have had issues, endometriosis, and then she had 10 years before she was diagnosed. Another one who's had a full hysterectomy because she had issues with her endometrium.
Right.
You know, it's just so complex. But
And that there is going to be something there. So a female doctor who had been through it would be the most guaranteed to not be part of this problem. But a female doctor or a healthcare professional who has not been through it, and therefore all men also, are likely to be susceptible to a failure of appreciation, really. Yeah,
I think so. And I think, you know, we need more awareness. Women's issue, like I say, the PCOS is it's not discussed a lot, and 1 in 10 women at least have it, and young ladies that are struggling with weight, with acne, they don't know what's going on. They could have this condition, and it's very complex, and it needs to be out there and discussed.
And it's another thing that we file under do something today and it will make everything better tomorrow, you know, even if it involves a bit of expense or a bit of redesign of the system, retraining, but it would actually mean that women like your daughter don't actually then have years of difficulty and pain.
Of waiting, of trying to play catch up, trying to understand why she has this, why she has that. And it's taken us to have to go private to find out what is actually going on underneath the bonnet. And it's, you know, and like I say, you've got 2 daughters.
I do.
It's just that awareness of, you know, if they change all of a sudden, why this is happening to them. It could be they have this condition. They could have something else. It's just very complex. It needs to be discussed. It needs a Davina McCall documentary. That's what it needs.
Yeah, I hear you. No, I hear you. I hear you. She's done amazing work on the menopause.
Her, but she's she's got her own.
Quite a lot going on at the moment.
Yeah, a lot going on. But, you know, we need her out there because it's, you know, just to stop this suffering and just to have.
I wonder what the numbers
to be looked after.
Yeah, I don't exactly that. Thank you. I'm sorry for what you're going through, but you've touched a lot of nerves, Jackie. Gary's been in touch. Thank you, Jackie. He writes, for airing this regarding PCOS. All the same symptoms. My daughter has all the same symptoms as Jackie's daughter. She was in absolute agony to the point of fainting last week. The pain was absolutely horrendous. Ambulance was promised, didn't turn up, so they basically left her to sit it out. I'm doubtful that a man in similar pain, for any given reason, would have been treated similarly. And that's the point. It's pain versus pain, I think, is at the heart of this story. I don't know how helpful it was of me to suggest earlier that men go a bit late, leave it a bit longer before they go. So by the time I went to A&E with abdominal pains was it about 5 years ago? I'm asking you because I probably told you the next day, didn't I? I came off air and went straight to A&E, and I should have gone about a week before. I won't put you off your lunch with the grisly details, but that was just what I was thinking of, and there may be some truth in it, but I don't think it's relevant to what people like Jackie and my other callers are describing today. 0345 6060 973 is the number you need if you would like to join in. I really recommend Caroline Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women, not just looking at medical establishment, looking at everything where the world is the system is built as if the world were populated exclusively by men. So one of the best examples in the book is crash test dummies, would you believe? So if you're trying to design car safety systems, whether it's airbags or safety belts or whatever it may be, if the crash test dummy you're using is based upon the average physiognomy of a man, then women are going to be exposed to unnecessary risk. So somewhere between the two, between the typical male body and the typical female body, would be the optimal safety system. But they instead use, or they certainly used to use when Caroline wrote the book, crash test dummies that are built according to the male physiognomy, which means that the systems put in place would be less helpful and less positive for the female body. I just find stuff like that fascinating. The stuff that has always been normal but shouldn't have been. And I'm also fascinated by the way in which a certain type of personality resists that idea that, well, because it wasn't around when I was young, it must be absolute nonsense. Down with health and safety and ADHD or whatever today's example is. I think it's a really important battle to continue fighting. It is 11:46.
James O'Brien on LBC.
49 PMQs on the way. It is the A-team, if that is not something of a misnomer. Keir Starmer and Kemi Badenoch. Did anyone find me the story? Can we find the story about Kemi Badenoch upsetting Nigeria? I'm sure I don't think I dreamt it. See if you can get hold of that for me. I've got a postscript to Missed Information, which I mean, it's a wonderful example of just how manipulative the media can be. Many of you pointing out that Gillian Keegan was here not long ago and wasn't asked about the £32 million that was spent on refurbishing the Department of Education when she was Education Set £32 million. But there's an even better story. So I think we'll play the sting again, actually. It's probably worth it.
Missed information.
So this story about £1,200 being spent on two folders, which I've explained to you, are leather embossed folders that will be used for storing documents for posterity. They come from the same company that makes the leather ministerial boxes. Some people pretending that it's a story, the Daily Mail most obviously, and B, something to get upset about or emblematic of a problem specific to the current government. True or false? When it was suggested that by using paper instead of vellum on official documents, the House of Lords could save £80,000 a year. I'll say that again, £80,000 a year by using paper instead of vellum in the House of Lords. Did Jacob Rees-Mogg write a newspaper article condemning it because the vellum conveyed the seriousness of the laws that were being written on the materials? True or false? Jacob Rees-Mogg actually wrote an article for a newspaper condemning attempts to save £80,000 by replacing vellum with paper for House of Lords business. And how many people pretending to be cross about £1,200 being spent as a consequence of a long-standing tradition on embossed leather government stationery even mentioned Jacob Rees-Mogg's defence of an £80,000 a year, I think, expense on blimmin' vellum. That's the technical term, by the way. That's the Latin. That is blimmin' vellum. And that concludes, for now, this.
Missed information.
But I have got another one. Don't let me forget. Stacey's in Crawley to steer us back to medical misogyny. Stacey, I'm sorry you're qualified to contribute to this conversation. What would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah, I originally called in with one point, and having listened to all of your callers, I've kind of got some different ones as well. So
I hate it when that happens. No, I love it. I love it when that happens. I'm joking. It's the best thing. Carry on. Fill your boots.
So my original point was, so I began menstruating when I was 12 years old. I'm now 33. And once endometriosis got ruled out as a possible cause for the intense pain and
can I ask how intense, without sounding weird?
Oh, but so between the age of 12 and 14, every time I had a period, I was hospitalised.
Good grief.
So after that, I could have been hospitalised, but I just kind of put up with it after that and built up my tolerance to it. I'm I've got a complete intolerance to like ibuprofen, paracetamol, things you can buy over the counter. So only pain medication from the doctors will touch the pain that I have every month now. But yeah, once endometriosis was ruled out, it was just accepted really that was how it was. One doctor told me at one point that having children would help. I've had 3 I've had 3 children and it hasn't helped, I can just say. But yeah, and that was a female doctor as well, just to point out.
Yes.
Which I think is really important, and that was kind of another point that I wanted to make, was that I've had that same kind of opinion from male and female doctors,
yes.
All the way through.
But that's what institutional means, isn't it? That's what institutional means.
Exactly. And I think it is a lack of understanding. You know, you have every woman's period is different, and every woman's cycle is different. And if you are talking to somebody who is lucky enough, and I do feel it's lucky enough to have lovely periods, really.
Yeah, I understand what you mean. I understand what you mean by that, yes.
They're not lovely, but then they're not going to have an understanding of that. It doesn't matter how much you read in a textbook, you know, but there needs to be some kind of education for doctors, because how long have we been menstruating for that this has been going on for?
And that's precisely the point of departure, isn't it? You sort of think that, well, or at least that's the point where you wonder, are we sure we've got this right? Because it's been going on for so long, you'd think. But I guess it just harks back to the days of women being second-class citizens.
Yeah, and women's problems being somehow not taken seriously. And I think it's a lack of trust in women knowing their own bodies as well. So, like I said, I have had 3 children. My second child stopped growing at 32 weeks while I was 32 weeks pregnant. But I was not listened to until 36 weeks, by which point he was very, very ill and came out very poorly. I knew something was wrong. I was telling them something was wrong. Yeah. I was not listened to. You know, it's been the same for all kind of women's problems over the years, and it is just, well, this is how it is. You know, women experience pain when they're pregnant, when they menstruate, in childbirth. It's always been like that, you know, it's written in the Bible.
I suppose that it harks back also to the days when childbirth was not a medical matter. I mean, it harks back to pre-medicine days, because you mentioned that it's been going on forever. But of course, medicine's a relatively recent, well, not relatively recent invention, but childbirth would normally take place at home. A doctor may or may not be in attendance. So and of course, the incidences of tragedy and stillbirth were much, much higher historically. Mm-hmm. So you just get on with it. And if something goes wrong, something goes wrong. That's probably still embedded somewhere in the sort of national consciousness.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. I wonder how you fix it. You just start listening more, I suppose.
I think so, and I think it's shared experience. You know, get people like myself. I really don't want to, but people like myself, having gone through these experiences, to be at these, you know, organisations where the doctors get together and learn about this kind of stuff. You know,
that's why Jackie talked about Davina McCall, isn't it? Because Davina managed to somehow just harness public attention on the menopause issue, and clearly this is, even though it's been around for as long as humanity has been around, these are issues that still need more spotlight, and the key question of who and how do you attract that spotlight remains. Thank you, and you'd be a great advocate for it. All my callers today would be. In fact, 11:56 is the time. I found the story. It's the Vice President of Nigeria who has hit out at Kemi Badenoch over comments she's made about the country where she grew up. Kashim Shettima has accused her of denigrating her country of origin. So I've said it before and I'll say it again. Eventually, the longer she stays in that post, there'll be nobody left that she hasn't offended, irritated or upset. A senior presidential advisor told the Financial Times, if the vice president has said that, then it is official. Many Nigerians don't appreciate her denigrating the country and making it sound like a leper colony. We live here and don't have that impression of our country. I think we're done on the medical misogyny, because PMQs is so okay, I apologise. We'll squeeze you in, Helen, in Derby, if that's all right with you. What would you like to say?
So I mean, echoing a lot of what other people have said. I've had problems since I was a teenager. I've also got other health problems as well. And it's taken me sort of 20 years of going to the doctors to get diagnosed with adenomyosis.
Good Lord.
And that started with going at 13, 14, 15. My issue was I didn't have a period, but I had all the symptoms. So I had all the pain, I had all the premenstrual symptoms, but I had none of the bleeding. And they just kept telling me how lucky I was that, well, at least you haven't got the bleeding and it will happen. Right. I eventually got my first period when I was 16, and then I had nothing but periods. They said, oh, your body's catching up with itself. Then I had no period.
Sounds unlikely. I'm no scientist, Helen, but I don't think they work like that, do they?
Yeah, it's a bit humoral, isn't it? Like it's really old school medicine there.
Yes.
Like, it's just kind of figuring its way out.
That's exactly that.
But yeah, I mean, as I went through life, I ended up getting diagnosed with Crohn's disease, which I got gaslit on that as well. So I think it's important to note that misogyny is not just on women-specific conditions.
It's on women's pain. It's on women's pain.
With any condition, yeah. But then once I got diagnosed with that, anything pelvic that's your Crohn's disease. And it was women doctors telling me that. It was even after an ectopic pregnancy. I never saw a gynecologist in an outpatient clinic. And when I finally got an ultrasound, it was actually a woman GP who was saying, look, I'll let you have this ultrasound, and when it's clear, you need to move on. And then it wasn't clear. And the gynecologist told me I was actually quite lucky that it came up on the ultrasound, because it's not a standard test for endometriosis or adenomyosis. You should be having a camera, like a keyhole surgery camera.
So I wonder how many women have just taken this as their normal and not done what you've done, not pursue it and insist that something must be done, and have just sort of reached a point after years where they've gone, well, this is my life now, and this is what I'm going to have to live with.
You get punished for pursuing it as well, though. So I've accessed my medical records, and there's notes in my medical records that talk about me in quite a derogatory way. Because
you refuse to be fobbed off.
Rights.
Because you refuse to be fobbed off.
And it talks about me, manipulating systems and things like that. And I studied 6 years at university doing history and journalism, so I'm quite aware of my rights, and that makes it easier for me to advocate. But I'm
precisely
very aware
my point. That is precisely my point about the people who wouldn't necessarily be able to do what you can do. And I hadn't factored in the negative responses that you find. I did warn you that we were short of time, Helen, so I apologise for curtailing your contribution. But it is that time of the week again, 12 o'clock on a Wednesday, while Parliament is sitting. When do they break up, Natasha Clark? Is this the last one?
No, I think this is the second last one.
They do next week as well.
I think we've got one more week to go.
What a time to be alive.
I know, it's my favourite time of the week.
What is likely to come? It's Barry's as well. He says, hi, James, we're looking forward to you and Natasha vying to see who can say potentially the most. Natasha is good, but you're the reigning champion. It's all to play for.
Absolutely. What's your buzz phrase? Because I was thinking about this the other day.
Extraordinary.
There you go. Okay. Absolutely.
It's absolutely
everything is extraordinary. Well, it is in British politics, isn't it?
I've got to stop saying
it. No, you're not the only presenter on LBC that has a buzz, as a classic buzz phrase. We can play this off air if you like.
What is coming up today, potentially?
Potentially. I'm told housing and planning might be something that Kemi Badenoch will like to talk about. Obviously, we've seen from the government this week their policy to build more new homes. We've seen Angela Rayner's decision to push through the M&S refurb on Oxford Street, and also a new super prison. That's going to upset a lot of people, because it is just putting homes in places where people just don't want them. And I think that's going to be a wedge issue for a lot of people.
And yet everyone knows they need to be built.
Exactly.
And I think Starmer has said MPs trying to agitate against prisons being built in their constituencies will be given very short shrift.
That's exactly what Shabana Mahmood told LBC earlier today. And it's going to be really tricky for Kemi Badenoch, right? She's got to try and find some differences between the government and some sticks to bash them with, without really having a proper policy platform for her own party yet. Yes. We know in the next couple of months she's going to be looking at all of these issues and actually coming up with some plans and ideas for what she's going to do with the Tory party. But until then, she is a bit stuck with just sort of finding holes to pick. And
she's already called on him to resign in week 3. So that's the fairly big gun that's already been self-spiked.
God, just leave it a bit, Kemi. Leave it a little bit. I think that might come up today. Migration was also something I was told could come up. Obviously, we've had the news from Syria this week. Will Kemi Badenoch use that to talk about, well, actually, this terrorist group that could potentially be forming the next government in Syria? Keir Starmer has said, he said it's too early to say whether we will deprescribe them. Is that something that she might potentially see?
See much mileage.
It's quite niche, isn't it? It's quite a niche issue.
Niche. I don't know that there's any clear blue water there. I don't know there's a position to adopt that would be the opposition.
No, but you just say, well, Pat McFadden says one thing, Keir Starmer says another thing. Have you got your position right on who you think's a terrorist or not? It's not a bad soundbite, I'd say. Obviously, we've got the farming tractors protest in Westminster again today. I've just been the victim of it.
Let's find out.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Prime Minister didn't seem to want to talk about appointing fraudsters to his cabinet. In fact, he seemed to want to talk about immigration. So let's talk about immigration. Yeah. He has relaunched yet again. Many new targets, 6 milestones, 5 missions. But why was cutting immigration not a priority?
Speaker, I'm glad she now wants to talk about immigration. Last week she said she didn't, and for good reason. Because the previous government presided over record high levels of immigration. The figures just a few weeks ago, nearly 1 million on net migration. That is unprecedented. A one-nation experiment in open borders under the last government. And she was the champion. She stood up and praised the then Tory Home Secretary for listening to her on removing caps on migration visas. So she was applauding it. Now she's furious about what she was campaigning for. We will drive it down. We will drive down lawful migration. We'll drive down illegal migration.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about open borders. He was the one campaigning for free movement. I was in this House asking for a lift on skilled migration. He was there supporting all of the people who should not have been in this country. He wanted us to relax immigration. But as he's so keen to talk about the past, let's look at his record. 4 years ago, the Prime Minister signed a letter demanding that foreign criminals be allowed to stay in Britain. Dozens of Labour and Liberal Democrat MPs repeatedly signed these letters insisting that rapists and murderers be allowed to stay here. One of those criminals, Ernesto Elliott, had 17 convictions, including for knife crime. After his deportation was blocked, Elliott went on to murder someone. He was able to stay here and murder because people like this man campaigned against deporting criminals. Will he apologise for signing these letters?
Mr. Speaker, I'd firstly remind her that when we're in the number now, under their watch, of migrants coming to this country, nearly 1 million, is over 4 times the number when we're in the EU. They lost control of the borders. And the particular example she puts to me is an example of failure under her government to take the necessary measures to keep our country safe.
Mr. Speaker, this is a ludicrous assertion. He is the one who was repeatedly signing letters. He even asked us to pause all deportations. He doesn't want to talk about his past, Mr. Speaker, but that letter is just the tip of the iceberg. There is more. The Prime Minister actually complained that the immigration system was working to deter migrants rather than provide support. He said, and I quote, that he was proud to have served as Jeremy's shadow immigration minister. He boasted that he took the last Labour government to court for cutting benefits for asylum seekers. He said he would never set a target-based approach to immigration. He wants to talk about immigration. Let's talk about his record. We can talk about it all day. I have committed... Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister says he wants to talk about immigration. I have committed to a cap on migration. Why won't he?
Mr. Speaker, She talks about my record. For 5 years, I was the chief prosecutor, prosecuting people who went to prison, many of whom were then deported. So while she's talking, I was actually doing the hard yards of convicting those that should be in prison. And she presided over record numbers of asylum seekers in this country, a record number of lawful and irregular migrants. That is 14 years when they lost control of the borders. They set a cap for each of those 14 years. It wasn't hard, it didn't stop people coming, and it got a record number. They should apologise for what they've done with their open borders policy.
Mr. Speaker, he did not answer a single...
Do you want to leave? If you've not got the guts to stand up to the comments, you shouldn't be in here. Let me beg up.
Mr. Speaker, he did not answer a single question. He never answers questions. He wants to talk about the past. The fact is, we've acknowledged where things went wrong. He will never take responsibility. He will never take responsibility. The fact is, he has scrapped a deterrent that the National Crime Agency has said we need. Since he came into government and scrapped the Rwanda deterrent, small boat arrivals have increased by nearly 20%. His own MPs are complaining about having to house asylum seekers. So can the Prime Minister tell the House how much more his government will spend on hotel accommodation because he scrapped the deterrent?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd invite her to tell us what went wrong under the last government, but it'd take us all afternoon. Mr. Speaker, we are going to smash the gangs that are running this vile trade. We signed a landmark agreement with Germany this week.
Order. Mr. Philp, you've been very loud. I think now we're going to have a little bit of silence from you, Prime Minister.
This week we signed a landmark agreement with Germany. She should be welcoming that, because that will make sure we have the powers to take enforcement action across the continent where it is needed. We've set up the Border Security Command. We've committed £75 million on top of the existing £75 million. We're extending the powers so they're counter-terrorism-like powers. We've retained 9,400 people who shouldn't be here. A record flight got off. They talk about getting the flights off. They did it for years. They didn't succeed. We got the flights off.
Mr. Speaker, he says he wants to smash the gangs. The only thing he smashed is his own reputation. The fact is, what he has been agreeing is not going to do anything. The cost of the Iraq agreement is £500,000. That wouldn't even buy a house in his constituency. Many of the things he's taking credit for are our agreements. Let's talk about what he put in his manifesto. The Prime Minister promised to end asylum hotels. He promised, he's the Prime Minister now, he promised, but in Altrincham and Peterborough, his government is expanding the use of asylum hotels because he unilaterally disarmed the deterrent. In fact, Mr. Speaker, a man who arrived by small boat told Sky News he was happy Labour were in power. That man said the Conservatives, and I quote, wanted to deport us, but Labour are making the procedure easier for us. He's right, isn't he?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I really thought she should welcome the Iraq deal. Anybody who wants to deal with this vile trade would have welcomed it. She should also welcome the German deal that we did this week. Many of the boats that are finding their way to the Channel are coming through Germany. That is well documented. There's been a difficulty in taking enforcement action, which if she spent more time researching that than her terrible jokes, she would know about. And we have signed an agreement to smash and take enforcement action in Germany to stop those boats getting to the coast. That is effective action. She should welcome it. It's really good news. All law enforcement think it's a good thing. Why does she think it's a bad thing?
Because the numbers are going up, Mr. Speaker, under his watch. The Prime Minister has consistently backed criminals over law-abiding British people. He defended terrorists like Hizb ut-Tahrir in the European Court. He argued all immigration law had a racist undercurrent. He voted against life sentences for people smugglers. He voted against more than 100 measures to control migration. He even said it was wrong. He even said, Mr. Speaker, that it was wrong when the Conservatives took away Shamima Begum's citizenship. Now he has appointed her defence lawyer as his Attorney General. Mr. Speaker, events in Syria mean we may see more small boat arrivals. For once, will he take the side of the British people and strip citizenship from jihadi terrorists and supporters of Assad who want to come back and destroy this country?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I was Director of Public Prosecution for 5 years. Unlike anyone on their benches, I was prosecuting for 5 years hundreds of thousands of criminals. That includes huge terrorist gangs, rapists. I was working for 3 of those 5 years with the then Home Secretary Theresa May, who commended the work that I did at the end of those 5 years. So for her to stand there and say, I haven't done anything in law enforcement, I dedicated 5 years of my life to law enforcement, locking up criminals, which is more than she can say. And it would be easier to take the opposition seriously if they actually got serious. Not a slither of remorse, not a hint of contrition. It's like the arsonist complaining about the people who are trying to put the fire out. And all they do is come every week with more and more complaints. Just wait till they get their hands on the people that created the mess that we are clearing up. We're fixing the economy, we're ending their open borders policy, we're taking down the waiting list. That's what people voted for. We're delivering it.
No law.
Mr. Speaker, since in the last couple of months, since I spoke to the Prime Minister here about the need for social and industrial investment in Cornwall, we've had a fresh tranche of shared prosperity funding, a huge boost to international interest in our most cleanest energy industries, and we've had a roadmap to greater political autonomy that reflects Cornwall's unique national identity. Will the PM join his minister on that visit in the spring to meet with the industry firsthand and spell out a roadmap for Cornwall to helping Britain become a clean energy superpower?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend. He's a champion of the extraordinary potential of Cornwall, particularly in our transition to clean power by 2030. Next week we'll publish our English devolution white paper, setting out our ambitions to move power from Westminster into every part of England, including Cornwall. And I know he and his colleagues are meeting the Deputy Prime Minister to discuss this next week.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While Syrians are rejoicing at the overthrow of the brutal Assad regime, many people there and around the world are worried about what comes next, as the Prime Minister indeed said, with the threats of extremism, ISIS terrorism and unsecured chemical weapons. Only an open political process can bring peace and stability, but that will require the full backing of the international community. So does the Prime Minister share my concern that President-elect Trump said about Syria, and I quote, "The United States should have nothing to do with it"? If America walks away and steps away, will he step up and work with other allies to provide British leadership over Syria?
Prime Minister.
Well, he's right to say this is a very serious moment. We all welcome the fall of Assad. I hope this can be a turning point for Syria, a much needed turning point, but that is by no means guaranteed, and that is why we've been speaking intently and intensely with our allies in the region across the globe about how we ensure that this is peaceful, it is political, and it's a rejection of terrorism and violence. This could be a turning point, but in the past we've always thought that what comes next is necessarily better. That hasn't turned out to be the case, and that's why we're working so hard on this and showing the leadership that he and the House would expect from this government.
Sir Ed Davey.
Can I thank the Prime Minister for that reply, and I hope we can continue to work on a cross-party basis to do Britain's role in securing peace and stability in the Middle East. But moving on to another subject, Mr. Speaker, British farmers are the best in the world. Yeah. They are the best in the world because of our tradition of family farms, where from generation to generation a commitment to high quality food, to our precious environment, animal welfare is passed down. But family farms were let down badly by the last Conservative government, with their botched transition to new payment schemes and their unfair trade deals with Australia and New Zealand that have undercut British farmers. Now, many family farms feel the government's budget will be the final blow. So will the Prime Minister change course and recognise the vital role that British family farms play?
Yeah. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as he knows, we put £5 billion into farming over the next 2 years. That's a record number under the budget. Last week alone, £350 million to support farmers in the United Kingdom. That does contrast with the last government, who was an underspend of £300 million in relation to farmers. In relation to inheritance tax, as he knows, in a typical family case, the threshold is £3 million, and therefore the vast majority of farmers will be unaffected, despite the fear-mongering of the party opposite.
Go Brettle.
Speaker, places of worship.
And it's 17 minutes after 12. Natasha Clark and I will return imminently to pick over the bones of what you've just endured.
James O'Brien on LBC.
I say endure. I'm so sorry. I meant enjoy. We're here to pick over the bones of what you just enjoyed. Before we do that, will you allow me a little moment of happiness, in a way, if that's the right word to use? Because I love it when the planets align. Steph has contacted me on Blue Sky to say, I'm loving the conversation about misogyny in women's healthcare. Involving men in these conversations is important for other men to hear, to help them understand these issues are real and affect so many women, especially those in their lives too. And almost in the same moment, I got a message off Dan via text, which said, I wonder how common this problem is, James. I'm a taxi driver, and I've just had a customer telling me about her endometriosis because the show's on in the taxi. She described the pain at the passing out. It took her years to get her diagnosis. Her story was almost exactly like all of your callers. Are we missing how serious this is? That's a thing of beauty, that. Isn't it? Juxtaposition of Steph saying it's really important that men hear this, and then a man saying, crikey, I've just heard this and I hadn't realised how important it was. Anyway, enough. Back to Natasha Clark. And, I mean, the jury is still out, but was that the worst yet? I mean, what is wrong with her?
I don't quite see why she decided to focus all 6 questions on arguably the Tories' greatest failure of the last 14 years, or one of, migration. It's not a strong topic for her. She was in the government which presided over the biggest increase in net migration ever, and she still thinks that this is a weak point for Sir Keir Starmer. You know, she started off by talking about the missions and why it wasn't part of Keir Starmer's main mission milestones, whatever, you know, are you keeping up, speech last week. I totally agree that that's a legitimate way to go down. Then started talking about all of his record, deporting foreign criminals or not. I just, I lost train of thought with the argument that she went on, talking about how, he's been, served as Shadow Secretary of State for Immigration under Jeremy Corbyn. He just, hit back time and time again with every single one, saying, well, you've been in government, this was all your problem. So it just doesn't work.
How does this happen? How is no one sitting, or maybe they are, and she's
I've got a list of other things you could have talked about.
Top of it, farmers.
Farming.
Today they're protesting literally outside Parliament about a tax policy that is controversial and quite unpopular, and she didn't even go there.
No, and to be fair, she has done in recent weeks. We have talked about that
they're
before.
Outside.
But it's quite easy when they're outside. At least one question on that. Housing and planning, really controversial topic for a lot of people. Do you want homes built in your own back garden, yes or no?
Yeah, I said to you beforehand, I don't see how she adopts an oppositional position on that.
Well, she says you should consult local people for what is being built in your back garden. And it's the NIMBYs YIMBYs argument there. Public sector.
YIMBY? Yes, in my backyard.
Yes, in my backyard.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a Labour YIMBY group.
Labour YIMBY.
Labour YIMBY group.
That sounds like a song lyric. Anyway, carry on.
A
Wumba way. That's what I was thinking of.
Very good. I'll ask them to put a jingle together for their next meeting for you.
It'll take months.
But yes, look, lots of other issues they could have talked about. Public sector spending. How is it possible that we can cut more from the state when we've had 14 years of arguably Tory austerity? How is it right that Rachel Reeves is now? She said she wouldn't continue with austerity. Now she's asking every department to cut 5%. The budget, businesses, fallout, farming, loads of stuff she could have gone on. And winter fuel, exactly. As people are starting to
questions on immigration, which, as you quite rightly describe, the large. I mean, in many ways, the biggest failure. It's debatable, but certainly something on which they are perceived universally to have had an absolute mare.
Yeah.
And she's trying to hit Starmer over the head with it. When he has gravity on his side in that these numbers are going to come down regardless of what he does. And the Brexit point was extraordinary, Tinniad, saying that he was in favour of free movement. And Starmer just comes back and says it's gone up exponentially since we left the European Union.
Exactly.
So that argument is absolutely
doesn't quite
ridiculous.
Work. It doesn't work at all. Absolutely fair enough.
I'm not enjoying it.
No, it wasn't fun this week.
Because this awful liberal impulse now kicks in.
I want him to do a little bit
watching
better.
People suffer.
Yeah.
I mean, the poor woman is obviously completely out of her depth, and she still thinks she's a superhero.
Yeah, that wasn't good, was it?
Schadenfreude.
I almost thought she might come back if she's been fresh from meeting JD Vance and Donald Trump's team in the States. I almost thought she might go on that. But look, there's a lot of things she could have talked about. I don't think she did particularly well today. The last couple of questions were better.
Yes.
Spending on hotels. You promised to end it. When's that going to happen? Boat numbers have gone up. You said you were going to stop them. When's that going to happen? You scrapped the deterrent. All actually legitimate arguments to have because they're about the last 5 months of Keir Starmer's government. And then she, spent ages talking about Keir Starmer's record and then says, I don't want to talk about the past. Well,
Yes, I noticed that. And she also accused him of not answering questions before she'd actually asked any. She was too busy reading out her charge sheet.
Yeah, I struggle to pay attention when she starts asking an actual question and she just goes off on this diatribe and then suddenly, what's the question again? I've forgotten it. But yes, I don't think this strategy quite worked for her today.
But
I don't think it was a topic that was ripe for her to pick it.
They'll do rehearsals. I mean, Michael Gove famously used to play the part of I don't know, Gordon Brown. Who would he have been playing the part of? But when they were rehearsing with David Cameron, Gove was apparently brilliant at playing the role of the opposition.
And you should be thinking every single time you're asking a question, Prime Minister's questions, whether what the answer he's going to give is going to be, and how you respond to it, and how you manage to pick up a hole in it and throw it back in their face. But she's not quite picked that up yet. And Keir Starmer just seemed more irritated by this tactic than anything else. He didn't,
a bit
didn't
confused.
seem like he was,
and her own benches didn't exactly look animated, did they?
No, the only person that was quite excited about it was Chris Philp, who got a ticking off from the Speaker, the Shadow Home Secretary, for shouting from the sidelines, which we know Lindsay Hoyle absolutely hates to see. But yes, her questions were confused. The messaging, I don't think, worked. Talking too much about the record under the Conservatives doesn't work. The best questions that you can as a leader of opposition go in on is the current record of the current government. And like I've said earlier, they don't have a policy platform yet. They don't have a lot of things to push. The best hope for you is to try and tease out some holes in their policy, some questions that they should be answering, and get them to defend themselves.
I don't know if this is the same mark. 2 marks perhaps, or 1 mark, who knows? Exactly, James. I used to look forward to PMQs. A few more weeks like this and you will be skipping it too. I don't think we'll ever skip it, but I certainly didn't enjoy. I don't know, it's different flavours of awfulness. I like some awfulnesses, but I didn't like that. And another mark, or possibly the same mark with the second message, writes, it's like she's in The Apprentice. It is a bit like she thinks she's in The Apprentice. Patrick says, even by the standards of right-wingers, she is absolutely insane. And Badenoch is so out of touch, it's sad now. A few more messages coming in. I'll try and find a positive one. Dave writes, Chris Philp is such a little pipsqueak. Every PMQs with Kemi Badenoch reminds me of the saying, never argue with an idiot. She is terrible. Let's hope she stays, says Rob. I think a period of silence, writes Tom, is in order from the leader of the opposition. About 5 years should do it. Extraordinary, he says, nicking my catchphrase, that they have the cheek to even talk of immigration and the costs associated with their deliberate policies of delay. £715 million spent on Rwanda, and it involved precisely 0 compulsory removals. I'm going to have to shut off LBC during PMQs, writes Tracy. The Tory leader is blatantly lying regarding information and knowingly spreading misinformation. LBC has a duty not only to fact check her, but to represent an accurate account of the facts. I don't know what you're specifically referring to. If you tell me, I'll happily look into it. And I like this from Mike. Badenoch going in on immigration, James. I'm reminded of Sir Humphrey. That's bold, Minister. Very bold. Bold indeed. So no positives.
No. And look, we talk repeatedly about how Keir Starmer doesn't really answer the question at Prime Minister's questions. If we're going to,
you did at the end there. You tried better at the end this time. Couple of texts have suggested.
Yeah, and look, he's got a really strong argument on why he, spent 5 years as DPP prosecuting hundreds of thousands of criminals.
Yeah.
Kemi Badenoch didn't do the same thing. Theresa May commended me for my work on this.
Gave you the knighthood.
Yeah. Exactly.
Which he didn't mention. I think a lesser politician might have done, or a more egotistical politician might have done.
But this is Kemi Badenoch's one chance of the week to get her message and voice noticed, and I don't think that was quite the right way to do that. And it's poor for democracy, isn't it? If you're not really challenging the Prime Minister properly, it just, like I say, it makes PMQs rubbish for the rest of us, and it also just is poor for politicians holding other politicians to account. Makes the whole thing.
I mean, if you had to pick a line that really sums up the awfulness of the whole thing, it would be the claim that she said that we've acknowledged the things that went wrong on our watch. I must have missed that.
Yeah, I must have missed that when she started talking about immigration, and she stood up and said, "Yeah, I'm sorry, we got it all wrong."
Yeah.
We must have both been out of the room for that one.
Yeah, why haven't you fixed our mess yet?
Yeah.
I think on reflection that Keir Starmer's line about the arsonist was probably a bit better than my rather lavatorial, scatological allusion to honest Bob Jenrick doing something in your kitchen earlier.
Yeah,
Not your kitchen, but doing something in one's kitchen earlier today.
Yeah, that was Keir Starmer saying it's like the arsonist complaining after they've burnt down the kitchen or something similar to that. Well, that went down all right. But yes, no jolly faces on either side of the house, I don't think, after that Prime Minister's questions. No one can enjoy that.
Isn't it? I get that. I mean, not a single... I really have tried to find a positive thing.
Is this the best we've got from our politicians?
Well, yeah. I mean, Starmer can only work with what he's given.
That's completely
by her.
fair.
I'm not saying that out of any partisanship. It would be true if it were the other way round, but he wasn't given anything today.
Look, Keir Starmer has all these answers on migration. You know, we talked about this last week.
Yes.
We talked about this, about how he's, talking very tough on it. But he has answers for this. Why aren't you welcoming my German deal? Why aren't you welcoming my deal with Iraq? I'm, up to deportations are up. I'm doing this. He's got, you guys presided over
this open borders line is going to be around for a long time, because that's like red meat that he's thrown into the Tory reform tensions, giving that, so they end up arguing with each other.
And maybe that's the reason why Kemi Badenoch's talking about this.
Because she's worried about that. It's a bit early to start worrying about that.
She should be worried about it.
Well, possibly, but 4.5 years out from a general election, an awful lot can change. Roll on next week. It is 12:30. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Tim Humphrey is here now with your... Oh, hang on, I missed one quickly. Liam's been in touch again. He sends this every week. Kemi has been brilliant today. On an unrelated note, I've recently had a lobotomy and wonder if you know the recovery time. Tim Humphrey has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 33 minutes after 12. I don't know what the arrangements are, Phil, with regard to the farmers who are protesting outside Westminster today. I think it's been officially organised, so they won't be subject to the prison sentences and such like that were introduced for blocking roads. And similarly, I don't imagine any of the usual suspects will be complaining about the difficulties ambulances might have getting through. But the pictures are striking because tractors are big, aren't they? I'm not going to win any prizes for my powers of observation on that one. But I guess there's a case for double standards, a case for accusations of double standards. As you know, this week on LBC, we've been promoting the work of Trussell and the importance of the food banks that they help to run. 1 in 7 people face hunger in the UK because, very simply, they don't have enough money to live on. And it is thanks to Trussell that I was joined earlier by Marie, who has been a recipient of that help and that food from a food bank in the past. Marie, thank you for joining us. Can you start by telling us about how you ended up in a food bank?
So the first time I needed to access the food bank was in 2020. I'd been furloughed from my job at an airline during the pandemic and then was later unfortunately made redundant. On top of that, I had an abusive ex-partner who was financially abusing me and our children, and he'd been evading his child maintenance obligations. So I was fighting for these child maintenance payments for 6 years, but as a result, we regularly had to rely on a food bank. It hasn't just been a one-off occasion, I'd like to point out. This is an ongoing issue for me. And I've needed to go to the food bank many times over several years, including when I was working and before I got ill, as well as earlier this year. I suffer with my mental health and I have several health conditions that mean I'm not able to work. In the last few years, I lost my son to suicide, which has massively impacted my mental health. There isn't the help or the services out there for people in my situation. I've been to the doctor. I was given 8 talking therapy sessions. I'm not better. When I saw the doctor at the mental health hospital, they told me that I was in a critical need of long-term trauma-specific therapy, but that there was only one psychiatrist for the whole area. So they've discharged me. They're not able to give me the help that I need, and this now causes me daily worry about not having enough money and how I'm going to support my family, which, as you can imagine, makes my mental health worse to the point where I can't function. It feels like I'm trapped in a vicious cycle. And you hear things like people need to get back to work, but there aren't the services to help us do that.
So give me an idea if you can, or give everybody listening an idea if you can of I suppose the best way to tell us what difference this has made in your life, what positive difference, is to wonder what would have happened if the food bank hadn't been there.
Yeah, so I mean, my experience is that everyone at the food bank was very welcoming and they were very discreet. I was signposted to other organisations that help with the debt and citizens' advice. The ladies from Citizens Advice helped me fill in forms for housing benefits and discretionary payments because the forms can be very long and complicated, and that was particularly helpful for me as I'm neurospicy. The food bank also gave me a one-off voucher for the local butchers to get some meat that week, which was really nice to have some fresh food as well. And the food bank also paid for my gas and electric. So I was in massive amounts of debt at the time, dealing with the financial abuse. Plus, it was the time of year, it was Christmas. I needed to put the heating on. And there were there's countless families out there dealing with similar situations this winter, which is why I really encourage people to donate.
Well, yes, that's a crucial point. Everyone can donate. Well, not everyone can donate, but everyone who can should. On the other side of the coin, there will be people listening to you now who kind of recognise some of what you've described. They certainly recognise the relationship between food and money for whatever reason. But it was interesting that you used the word discreet, because you understand, I think, why they might be thinking, I can't do that. I know I'm struggling, but I don't really want to ask for help. What would you say to them? I would encourage people to not feel scared and to reach out for help if they need it. You just never know what's around the corner in life, and this service is there for a reason. It shouldn't be there. We shouldn't have to rely on a food bank, but they are there for people in time of need, and if you genuinely are struggling, you will get help, and they're very accommodating and caring. If I'd met you 10 years ago, is this something you would have foresaw appearing in your life? No. I didn't think so, and that's the point in a way, isn't it? If you had the power, if I put you in charge of everything, but only for one day, all right, what would you do so that no one has to turn to a food bank? I would reform all the social security and government policies. I would look at food instability. As a parent, I'm expected to safeguard my child. Children are going without. They're going without food, shoes, all sorts of stuff. So again, that's another big issue that could be resolved. So many holes that people can slip through, and if it isn't for organisations like Trussell, then they don't get you don't get caught. It's pulling back all the layers and looking at the root causes of why people are now being forced to turn to food banks. And does it change a bit at Christmas? The food banks help you celebrate Christmas? So the food banks put together Christmas parcels for families, which I have accessed last Christmas. For me, coming home with a car full of food at Christmas and my children opening the cupboard and saying, "Wow, Mummy, we've got food and we've got something," and there was things like Pringles, things like, chocolate biscuits that to other people might seem like nothing. But at that time in my life, that was a massive thing for me to see as a mum. I don't think anyone thinks Pringles are nothing. Really. Thank you. I'm so glad you could join us today. Thank you to Marie and, of course, to Trussell. I think the most important thing to remember is that your donation this Christmas can give someone hope for a brighter future. Indeed it can. I hadn't heard that phrase neurospicy before, but like you, Dom, I'm rather taken with it. A complete change of pace now. You will have heard, if you were listening yesterday, Nogatan Opolski talking to us from Tel Aviv, where Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption trial was underway, something he sought to simultaneously dismiss and deny, dismissing by treating the court with a modicum of contempt, and deny by claiming that he'd been far too busy to be corrupt. There is a film poised to hit British and Irish cinemas very soon, on Friday in fact, which rather gives the lie to some of those claims. It's called the Bibi Files, and it is a consequence, as we will shortly hear, of some never before seen footage of police interrogation videos of Netanyahu, his family, his closest associates and his benefactors that fell into the hands of the film's producer. We'll talk to the director shortly, but first, here's a little taste.
After the catastrophe of the 7th of October, the war became another instrument to stay in power.
When people serve for too long, it gets into their head.
The indictment made him dependent on the extreme right in Israel.
He is now captive to their whims.
He put all Israel in a turmoil.
It is 12:41 and Alexis Bloom is the director of the Bibi Files and she joins me now. I mean, the entire project hinges upon these leaked interrogation videos and I can't expect you to tell me where they came from or where you even think they might have come from. So I wonder what difference the October the 7th terror attack made to the work that was already underway when it occurred, Alexis.
Well, of course, October 7th was very traumatic for the country and nobody knew what was going on for the first few days. Nobody knew how many hostages were gone, how many people were killed. So we paused and I waited a few weeks. I went in November to Israel to see whether anyone wanted to still talk about Netanyahu. And we found that they did. And although I would say October 7th changed the country and traumatized it, and of course was the springboard for this war, it didn't really fundamentally change Netanyahu. And it didn't really change the film in a way, because he was still the same man, and the family was still the same, and the corruption trial was still in play. It's just that the stakes were so much higher. Because of the lengths that he is alleged to be prepared to go to in order to ensure his own political survival. And the trials that are at the centre of the film are essentially a fast track towards not just political oblivion, but potential conviction. There are three, aren't there? There are three separate cases in total. There are three separate cases at the moment. He's been indicted for and he's on trial for. He's been involved in a number of different cases before, and there's still sort of speculation about a number of cases that haven't been sort of legislated in the same way, that do not form part of the actual indictment. But yes, at the moment, there are three. And counting, as you remind us. When you and Alex Gibney, the producer who first got hold of the footage, were going through it, just at risk of a slightly crass question, what were the sort of most jaw-dropping moments that you both encountered? Well, I don't speak Hebrew, so going through it was fascinating, but also a real challenge. So I had to look at the body language a lot. And, sometimes I would look at files and not know what they were saying. So the body language of Sarah and Yair was fascinating. You could see how oppositional they were and how angry they were immediately. Mm-hmm. This is the wife and son. Yeah, the wife and son. I mean, they speak to the police with, oh God, what's the word? I mean, disrespect would be putting it mildly. They're really, really rude. At some point, Yair calls the police the Stasi, the Gestapo. He swears at them. The wife gets furious. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu also loses his cool, but it's rare. At some point, most often towards the end of the interviews, sort of the carefully cultivated mask drops and he bangs the table and he starts yelling. But it takes a lot for him to get there. He's a consummate professional and his body language is completely different. But also, I mean, the testimony of the people around them was so fascinating because some of them who were loyal appointees of the family do confess what they did. And, they're very contrite. They're very sorry. We didn't have time to include all of them, but, some of them start crying. Some of the lesser players start crying. So it's fascinating. And the Financial Times reports that this is Israel's prime minister as the public has never seen him before, a man at the mercy of his interlocutors, stripped of rehearsal and on the back foot, as you say, consummate professionalism notwithstanding. The sight of him being confronted with evidence in real time is a filmmaker's dream, I think. Well, it's a film. I mean, it's interesting. He is such a professional. The Financial Times has said that. Other outlets have said other things. Okay. I mean, his ability to deny and say, I don't know, was for me, jaw-dropping.
Right.
So he is, I mean, I had at one point like a 5-minute sequence in the film where he says, I don't know, I don't remember, I don't know, I don't remember. And my editor was like, you can't do this. It's too excruciating for the audience. But I want the audience to feel what the policeman must have felt.
Yes.
Because he doesn't remember things where he was in the room. There's one instance where he doesn't remember recording somebody. He had the cell phone that was doing the recording in his own jacket pocket. So the idea that he didn't remember doing that, to me, was it just stretched credulity.
And it's not just former allies. Of course, you speak to journalists, other Israeli politicians, and painting a picture that is designed to do what, Alexis, ultimately? Well, because you also intersperse the footage, the leaked footage, with sort of biographical detail, the rise, if you like, of Netanyahu, not yet the fall, although that might be part of your answer to the question. What is it designed to do, this film?
Well, I mean, the film, this chorus of people contextualizes what we're seeing. It's hard to understand the minutiae of the corruption trial without people around explaining what you're seeing. And those people form a very insightful and intelligent sort of body of evidence. And the film, I would say, is designed to show you that there's daylight between Netanyahu and a lot of other people. Daylight between Netanyahu and Israel. He is not Israel. There are, hundreds of thousands of protesters sometimes in the street, asking for him to resign. So if the film does anything, it gives people a language to say, listen, he's a politician like anyone else. It's not anti-Israel and it's not anti-Semitic to criticize him. He's a politician.
Indeed. And I wonder who's going to see it, because, of course, the Israeli government tried to block its screening at the Toronto Film Festival earlier this year. I've mentioned that it's going to be in UK and Irish cinemas and available on demand from Friday in this country. How easy is it going to be for people in Israel to see it?
They have pirated this film like nothing else. I mean, it's unbelievable. I have colleagues there who text message me every time they're offered a link.
Gosh.
And it's just, it's spread like wildfire. So, of course, unofficially, I'm shocked. And I mean, sorry, I take that back. Officially, I'm shocked, and unofficially, I'm delighted.
There's a rare example of filmmakers welcoming piracy.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Well, if they're with digital, I always say, like, digital information flows like water. There's no blocking it. So obviously there's just been a really, really high demand for it there. And you can't really do anything about it. It's sort of the will of the people. Yes. And people just really want to see it. I thought that Israelis would know everything about this. It's actually a film made for an international audience. We've been very surprised about how much Israelis want to watch it.
And I think the same will apply to people heavily invested in the defence of Israel's recent conduct in this country, who perhaps are not entirely au fait with what Benjamin Netanyahu stands accused of. Alexis Bloom, many thanks indeed. As I said, Alexis directed the film The Bibi Files. I'll just run you through those three cases to prove her point, really, about people not really knowing enough about this. In one, Netanyahu and his wife are accused of receiving gifts from a Hollywood producer and the Australian billionaire James Packer in exchange for political favours. In the second case, Netanyahu purportedly offered a deal to the Israeli magnate Arnon Moses, seeking positive coverage in his newspaper, Yedioth Aharonoth, in return for legislation to hamper the circulation of a rival paper. And in the third case, although as Alexis reminded us, this isn't necessarily going to be the final total, Netanyahu is accused of granting regulatory favours to Shaul Elovitch, the owner of a telecoms group called Bezek, in exchange for favourable coverage on the news website Walla. An extraordinary film, The Bibi Files, as I say, released on Friday. It's 10-1.
James O'Brien on LBC.
4:53 is the time. I want to find out a little bit more about what some of the language surrounding asylum applications from Syrians truly mean. So we'll talk shortly to Zoe Gardner, the independent migration policy expert. But before that, and on a similar theme, in fact, something's just happened in a court in Kingston, in London, that I think I'm just going to read some copy to you regarding. It's quite confusing because it's not a conviction in any conventional sense. It's a trial of the facts, which is quite a rare legal device that occurs when a defendant is not well enough to either admit or deny a charge, but a case needs to be concluded. In this case, the defendant was put on trial in March of this year, but that trial was aborted after he suffered an episode of very, very serious mental ill health. So with that in mind, I just want to read you 2 or 3 paragraphs that speak directly to some of the concerns that I routinely try to bring to your attention, despite it involving a degree of swimming against the tide of much media coverage of immigration and asylum issues. A Nazi sympathiser has been found by a court to have prepared a terrorism attack on an immigration law firm after choosing them as a target after reading a Daily Mail article. Cavan Medlock carried a Nazi flag and a knife into a London solicitor's offices in 2020 and then launched an attack on staff. The attack caused so much alarm that senior lawyers lobbied the then Home Secretary, Dame Priti Patel, to reconsider some of the language she and others were using, claiming that it was adding to tensions. Leaders, if memory serves, they did not heed that warning or indeed accede to that request. Leaders in the profession say the incident has led to continuing concern as extreme right-wing groups single out lawyers for abuse and threats. During his police interview, Medlock said he had chosen the firm and its immigration chief as targets after they had been named in a Daily Mail article 3 days earlier. So it's not a criminal conviction, as I said, but a conclusion by a jury of factually what happened. I will leave you to decide whether or not the leaders in the profession who said the incident had led to continuing concern as extreme right-wing groups single out lawyers for abuse and threats is pertinent to what you heard at today's PMQs. But as I said, Zoe Gardner, the independent migration policy expert, joins me now because you have felt the need, Zoe, to provide an explainer really on what it means when we read or hear that there is going to be a suspension of asylum applications by Syrians in the UK in particular and the EU more widely. Why the need for the explainer and what is the explanation?
Yeah, thanks for having me, James. Well, I saw that there was quite a lot, as usual, actually, on the topic of immigration, of reporting that seemed written essentially by somebody who was uncurious about finding out about the complexity and the actual workings of the policy they were reporting on. So, we saw a lot of reports saying the Austrian government is putting in place a plan for deportations of Syrians, which seems to have been based entirely on the fact that the leader in Austria did tweet that he is a hard right anti-immigration leader. He tweeted about the fact that he would like to see Syrians returned. That has no bearing whatsoever on his ability to do that. It would be highly illegal. There isn't a court in Europe that would allow the forced deportation of Syrian refugees back to Syria at the current time, because it's very, very clear that the situation there is not yet settled and not yet safe. And then
the UK angle. Well, because I've read similar, well, not quite, I haven't read about deportations, but I've read about suspensions.
Yeah, and this, again, it can be hyped up in the media looking for clicks, sort of presented as some kind of ban on Syrians applying for asylum. That's not the case either. What's going on here is that Syrians who are currently still in the asylum procedure, so the vast majority of Syrians who are in the UK have been here a long time. They will have refugee status. They might even have citizenship. But there are 6,500 Syrians still stuck in the limbo of the asylum procedure. And what the Home Secretary has said is that we will not be making any decisions on those Syrian asylum claims during the time that the situation in Syria is in flux. And that's not as unreasonable as what's been suggested in some of the reporting. However, it is actually a very serious concern still, because why are there 6,500 Syrians languishing in the asylum system long term when we know that for the past several years, almost all Syrians who apply for asylum in the UK are granted refugee status eventually? Why are they waiting for so long? And the answer to that is we have a highly dysfunctional asylum system. So actually suspending their claims at the current time just means freezing them in this sort of limbo situation where they have no right to work, and they're accommodated in really squalid shared accommodation sites, and it's just refusing them the support and stability that they need while they're looking at what's unfolding back home. So it would make much more sense to offer them a temporary humanitarian status that gave them the right to work, that allowed them to support themselves and get out of those awful asylum hotels. So hopefully we should see a follow-up to this quite hasty announcement that we've had from the government in response to the situation in Syria.
Hasty, a generous word, I think. Zoe.
Yeah, it's interesting that the very first thing that they had to say that was concrete was about it.
I don't know that you can answer this question. I don't know if there's a precedent for it, but what would the end of this hiatus look like in Syrian terms? What would a country need to do or achieve in order to cease being a place from which asylum applications would be routinely accepted? Well, and actually, let me rephrase that. A place to which people will be happily and safely wanting to return.
Yeah, and that's the key, because at any time, Syrians who are here in the UK are looking now with hope at the idea that they might be able to return. But that has to be done when people are able to make an informed decision about their safety if they do go back.
Right.
And essentially, there are lots of reasons why people might need protection from a country. In Syria, obviously, the primary driver of asylum applications was the brutal Assad regime that, I don't know if your listeners will have seen the footage of the concentration camps being liberated. Horrendous scenes of torture cells that his regime was running. So that falling is one part of it. But there are extreme generalized areas of instability and violence in Syria. And a lot of the people who have escaped from Syria may well have come from areas that the Assad regime wasn't even controlling at the time. So we're looking at a long road ahead before there is clear stability and a government that is accountable and democratic in Syria. And that is what is needed, really. You need to have a government that is able to protect its citizens from persecution and from generalized violence.
The road is long, but happily the direction of traffic for once is largely positive. Thank you, Zoe Gardner, as always, for your help in understanding issues which, as you say, can often be dominated by the uncurious. And beautiful turn of phrase. If you missed it, hang on, last word on PMQs goes to Sharik. Will you answer my questions, James? Why don't you answer my questions? For 5 years you haven't answered my questions. Oh, wait, I forgot to ask any. What a catastrophic failure of parliamentary discourse. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4, but here's Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.